In the hush that follows evening, when the sky leans close and the moon takes her place like a quiet witness, the world seems to forget its hurry. Breath by breath the air cools, dust settles in gentle rings upon stone, the long shadows rest, and something very old exhales. It is in this hour, soft and unhurried, that the whisper of time becomes audible, not with clamor or command, but with a patient rustle, as if the earth remembers an old lullaby. Listen, and you will hear it. A low, steady telling of a place where years folded into each other like pages kept safe in a careful hand. There is a tender quality to memory here, a resilience that bends but does not snap. The kingdom, when it lived, moved with a measured grace. Rivers braided through the land like threads of light. Fields, once tilled by hands that knew the weather by touch, opened in broad, deliberate folds. Houses gathered like small moons around courtyards, and lanterns, tended by careful fingers, warmed faces as the world leaned into dark. The people were not great in number, but they carried a singular patience, and patience in that place had the force of a pact. The moon had a kind of governance over the nights. It did not command, but it held watchful compassion. Moonlight lent clarity without harshness. It made shapes out of the ordinary, and turned labor into ritual. People walked by its light with deliberate steps, and their stories were told in soft tones, not for the telling, but for the shaping of hours. There was a reverence for the slow change of things, for the manner in which a seed becomes a stalk a stand of grain, and grain a meal, shared when the rains returned. Waiting was not idleness, but a form of care, an active tending of hope. It would be wrong to imagine this kingdom as some unruffled Eden, for under placid surfaces there are always currents. Disagreements came and were resolved in long conversations by hearths. Small ambitions flickered like candles, not always loudly, but a prevailing calm held, like a well-tuned instrument sustaining a simple chord through its day. Festivals were extended meditations, the slow procession of lanterns, the soft percussion of hand drums, the low repeating of a phrase that settled in the chest and offered breath a place to rest. Their worship, where it existed, took the form of gentle attention rather than thunderous zeal. Temples, if one could call them that, were built to receive light, to frame a beam of sun or moon, and make a quiet place of listening. Columns rose like patient trees, supporting open roofs where pigeons nested and dew gathered. Priests and keepers of memory moved among the people like gardeners, pruning and encouraging growth. They collected records on thin strips of clay and on long rolls of faded fiber, preserving names and small accounts of births, rains and harvests, each entry a bead in the community's long necklace. The kingdom's borders were not carved by walls alone, but by an unspoken agreement among neighboring peoples. Trade passed through with slow caravans. Merchants who came spoke of distant soils and spices, of dyes that stained cloth like dusk, yet the land remained intimate. The marketplace was not a battlefield of bargaining, but a place of exchange where goods and stories were traded with equal care. Children learned the routes of the rivers before they learned the names of kings. Songs contained maps, lullabies taught irrigation. In such a place, knowledge was woven into everyday acts. In the making of their homes there was gentle attention to material and memory. Walls were faced with plaster smoothed by hands that knew the right pressure to make a surface warm to the touch. Doorways were carved with small private symbols, a crescent for a family, a scallop for a trade. Courtyards held jugs of water that took in the day and released a coolness at night. One could read a household like a slow poem. From a distance the town looked like a sleeping constellation, each house a small star connected by the dim lanes of lantern light. The arts here moved with restrained grandeur. Painters and weavers did not seek to astonish, they sought to complete. Tapestries stretched story by story, a slow chronology woven into thread. Colors were sun-softened, cinnamon browns, river mud umbers, pale lapis, smudged by finger and time. Music drifted like fog, not sweeping like a storm but pooling in corners and staying. Instruments were simple, voices steady. Songs were layered in repetition, a phrase returning like the tide to steady the listener. The craft of making was its own meditation, each piece a testimony to patience. In such a world, governance felt less like spectacle and more like tending. Elders met in circular chambers with low benches and cups of warm broth. Decisions came by listening, by letting each speaker finish, and the echoes of their words settle before answering. Consensus was prized over decree. Laws when set down were concise and aimed to uphold daily life, fair sharing of water, keeping the road clear in harvest, the protection of the housebound. Punishments were rarely severe, they were reparative, aimed to restore balance rather than punish. Yet the clear melody of life was not immune to the soft weathering of time. The river that fed the fields changed course over generations. Communities adapted terraces and replanned their planting. Stones that once lined a fountain found new use as seats beside markets. Laws once apt for a certain kind of exchange grew less suited when trade routes shifted and new travelers arrived. With patient adaptation, the people endured, their small systems bending without break. It is important to remember that lives we might deem quaint were in truth rich with intention. People carried a legacy of care. They cultivated kinship with the land and with one another. They raised children who rid the sky and soil, who could fashion a roof to hold through wind and time, who knew the names of herbs that could ease a cough. Their knowledge was practical and poetic, and through the measured passing of skills from hand to hand, the community held continuity like a woven cloth that might be mended but not torn. As night deepened, the moonbeam found the highest stones of the communal hall and laid a silver stitch across weathered tops. Men and women gathered at the edge of such light, stories moving with them in whispers. They spoke of ancestors small in number but mighty in patience. It was said the kingdom prospered because it knew how to wait for rains, for trade, for the right season to plant. Waiting there was an act of preparation and mindfulness. Still, as in every living thing, certain strengths ebbed while new needs grew. Children began to ask different questions. Traders brought luxuries that stirred appetites for beauty beyond usefulness, for ornament, for comfort that lasted beyond a single season. Desire arrived quietly like a second light in a room, and it changed what was there before. The seed of ambition often wore the face of curiosity. A builder pondering a tower to touch the moon, a potter dreaming of a deeper blue glaze, a teacher imagining a larger school. These ambitions could be generous, giving rise to new crafts and richer songs. The danger came when appetite outpaced care. Tonight, beneath the patient moon, we begin that telling. We sit at the edge of a gentle memory and watch it unfurl, following the soft lines of a life once lived. The kingdom will show itself not as sudden drama, but as a slow, living thing that unfolded day by day. We will trace the hands that built, the songs that soothed, and the small choices that, woven together, shaped a destiny both ordinary and profound. Time in its wisdom keeps the story for those willing to listen. So let the night hold you, and let the whisper of time continue, patient and steady, as we move deeper into memory. They came slowly, as all gentle beginnings do, in small families and clusters of kin, who knew the language of the land before they named it. The first footprints were not those of armies or of people seeking to conquer, but of those who listened to where the water paused and the clay felt warm to the hand. They arrived with woven bundles and a patience taught by seasons, following a ribbon of river that wound through low hills and marshes, carrying with it a promise of silt and a promise of growth. The river was their first teacher. It taught them where the soil would yield, where the reeds would stand tall enough for shelter, and where the shallow pools would hold fish until the cold dissolved them into spring. In those early years, life was measured by small certainty. A child learned the shape of the spoon before the shape of the world. The act of planting became a language. One stone turned over, one furrow made, one seed pressed into the dark. And remember, each household kept a small jar of stored grain for times when the sky withheld rain, and each family kept a tale of the last hard winter, so that memory might stand ready like grain in reserve. There was an economy of care. A neighbor's hand would come at harvest, and the next season the help would return. These were not transactions of ledgers, but of woven trust, kept in the soft ledger of speech and small favors. Names were given with intention. A child born under a full moon might be called by a word meaning silver thread, while a child who came when swallows returned would be named for flight. Place names grew from lived acts: the bend where reeds made a shelter, the hill where the first stone was set for a hearth, the low terrace where the water lingered long enough for frogs to sing. These names formed a loose map that every resident could read by ear, and in time these whispered maps allowed people to move with ease across distances that once felt daunting. The first shelters were humble, thatch held by poles, mud packed and smoothed, doorways kept low to hold heat. Courtyards were central, small plazas where jars of water cooled and where breads were baked in communal ovens. People slept with doors open to smell the night herbs and smoke, the distant call of an owl, feeling the sky as an overhead roof. Food was shared with modest ceremony. A stew would be ladled in silence until a child spoke of the day's finding, and then conversation took a slow cadence, as careful as the stirring of the pot. With the settling of households came the slow emergence of craft. One woman learned the secret of a stronger weave, twisting reeds with a rhythm that held water without soaking. A potter discovered how to press clay against the wheel in a way that made bowls sing softly when rapped with a fingernail. These small discoveries were celebrated as if they were gifts from the gods. A better basket meant less spillage at market. A more resilient pot meant fewer hours spent mending near the hearth. Skills were taught from hand to hand. There were no formal schools, only the gentle schooling that comes from sharing a bench and watching, then trying until the right motion became familiar. As people stayed, the landscape changed in subtle ways to reflect their needs. Terraces were cut into slopes to slow the water and give roots a steadier hold. Channels were dug to guide seasonal floods where they were wanted and away from places where they might smother seed. Stones were collected and placed where they could steady the bank. These small acts, repeated year after year, formed the beginnings of irrigation, a practical poetry that rearranged the land into patterns of sustenance. Where once wild grass grew, now neat rows followed the sun. The earth learned to answer back. With abundance came a beginning of a family who excelled in weaving traded baskets for fish. A potter exchanged decorated bowls for smoked meat. Trade was modest yet meaningful. Goods traveled on shoulders and on small boats that hugged the riverbank. The boats were first simple skiffs, dug from single trunks and hollowed carefully, then improved into wider hulls that could carry more grain and more stories. Along these low routes news traveled as well. A new medicine learned in a distant hamlet, the melody of a song that pleased the elders, different methods of stacking grain to avoid the weevil. The world felt, slowly, a bit smaller. The first communal gatherings were humble and soon became sacred in their repetition. They were held at the turning of seasons when planting or harvest demanded a collective attention. People would bring small offerings, an egg, a handful of barley, a favored herb, and lay them upon a flat stone, or the lip of a well. These were not extravagant rituals but acts of naming. We are here, we depend on one another, we will remember. At night, torches flickered and shadow played across faces, while the elders told the story of how the first hearth was lit, or how the river had guided a family that once wandered until they found a place to call home. These tales bound people to the place like in time some among them became keepers of records, not in books that would last 1,000 years, but in thin strips of baked clay, and in the careful rows of knots on woven cord. They recorded the year a well was dug, the arrival of an unusual bird, the debt repaid, or the settlement of a quarrel. These were small archives, but they formed a new layer of memory, one that could be consulted when disputes arose, or when the elders wished to recall which season a drought had come. Memory, once only human and easily forgotten, gained a hard edge in the form of these careful marks. As their numbers grew modestly, there emerged a gentle division of labor that did not harden into rigid class, but offered places of expertise. There were those who knew the medicinal uses of desert herbs, and those who could read the thin bands of light on the river to predict a frost. Some kept the fire under the communal oven, others maintained the channels and checked the simple sluices that guided the water. Each task lent a steady rhythm to the days. The rhythm itself became a kind of law, a natural order that the people found easier to follow than written compulsion. It comforted them that each morning brought a task to be done, and each evening a measure of completion. Leadership arose not by thunderous decree but by the slow recognition of steady talent. A woman who could calm a frightened child, or a man whose decisions about when to dig a channel saved a field from flood, would find neighbors seeking their counsel. These leaders carried not a crown but a responsibility, to listen more than to speak, to carry news with clarity, to mediate disputes with an eye toward repair rather than punishment. They learned early that authority in such a community was fragile, unless it was earned through humility and service. Power was therefore light and practical. It was the power of a hand that could mend, and the ability to bring people together under a single shared choice. The first public spaces took shape organically. A broad flat stone at the center of the cluster of dwellings became the place for announcements. A slightly raised platform of tamped earth hosted the elder who would tell of incoming travelers. A shallow pit filled with water reflected the sky and became a spot for both practical washing and for quiet reflection.
There were no great civic buildings yet, only modest places that fit into the daily life of a people who prized usefulness. Over these shared places the community grew familiar with each other's rhythms. The marketplace and the meeting spot existed in the same breathing space. Soon small innovations altered the texture of life. The potter's kiln was refined to reach a steadier heat, making ceramics less porous. The weaver dyed yarns with a plant that held its color through seasons. The smith learned to temper a blade with oil and careful cooling, producing tools that saved the farmer hours in a season. These improvements were not isolated wonders but cumulative ones. As they accumulated, life's friction eased, allowing attention to drift into other things, song, ornament and thought. With a firmer hold on provision, people began to look beyond the immediate and ask quietly what else might be possible. Stories multiplied as needs were met. Tales of creation were told beside lamps, each night adding new detail until they formed a shared myth of origin. In one telling, a woman followed a fox to the river, and there learned which roots to boil for winter. In another, the moon herself guided a lost fisherman back to shore. These stories taught practical lessons, wrapped in the warmth of narrative. They instructed about weather and seasons, about which herbs soothed fevers and which stones made a stable hearth. They also taught about the right way to live among neighbors. Share bread, do not take more than your share of water, and remember where you came from. Children played roles in keeping these lessons alive. They were given tasks early, not to be burdened but to be made useful, carrying water in small jars, stacking kindling, gathering eggs. In play they enacted the life of the village, pretending to be elders, calling for harvest, pretending to barter in markets. Such play was training disguised as joy. It confirmed to the young that they belonged to a place and to a future. There was too an increasing sense of order in the way they marked time. Where once the seasons were felt more than measured, the people began to mark certain days as especially significant. The first rain, the last frost, the day when the river rose highest. These days gathered stories and music and small enactments that folded memory into calendars. Over years these marked days became reliable poles in the passing of time, giving people a shared rhythm to look forward to and to prepare for. They became a means of continuity, a way to bind one generation to the next. All of this water management, craft, record keeping, shared rituals, a mild form of leadership, constituted what can rightly be called the birth of something larger than mere survival. From the soft accumulations of skill and story, a civilization began to take shape. It was not a monument raised by a single hand, but a gentle architecture, formed by many small attentions. The land had been shaped to help sustain them, and in return they shaped their lives around the cycles that land insisted upon. Yet, in the midst of birth, there is always a quiet question of what else may be possible. As the community's needs were met, curiosity took a more public role. People began to wonder what lay beyond the low hills or downriver past the reeds. Traders who returned with tales of distant colors and tastes loosened the notion that their world ended at the horizon. At night, under the same moon that had watched their first efforts, ears that had learned patience also learned longing. This longing was not a ruinous hunger, but a small insistent curiosity that would, in time, become one of the engines of growth. So the birth of this civilization was a balance between dwelling and dreaming. It began in the practical shaping of earth, in the steady rhythms of craft and shared tasks, in small rules made to smooth life's frictions, and in stories that both taught and delighted. It carried within it a trust that the future could be tended like a garden, with regular care, time, and the passing down of skills. In the soft light of evening, when the last of the work was done, and the lamps were lit, the people would gather and let stories unspool. They would look upon their hands and see in callous and careful motion the proof that their place could hold them. That proof was modest and true, and it was enough to carry them forward toward an age where order itself would be shaped and deepened, where the songs and the channels and the jars would find their fuller expression in a culture that would, for a time, glow like quiet moonlight. In the broad, patient hours that follow a civilization's modest beginnings, a quality settles like a slow tide. It is not sudden or violent. It arrives as a deepening of habits and a gathering of small improvements, until the whole feels steadier. This is the age that comes when the simple rituals of survival begin to organize into a larger music. People fold the day into tasks, tasks into systems, and systems into a life that hums with a quiet, assured order. The kingdom learned to be deliberate in its movement. Work followed a rhythm, and that rhythm taught the people how to shape a life that could hold through seasons. Order here was not a rigid architecture imposed from above. It was a practice learned by many hands, a soft infrastructure, formed by repeated acts. Water channels were managed with a calendar of sluice openings. Those in charge kept a record of flood years and lean years, and the rhythm of release and retention became a communal trust. The same hands that had once dug terraces now supervised their filling, watching the slow sigh of water sinking into rimmed beds. Farmers coordinated planting so that neighbors did not compete for the same labor at once. They staggered sowing and harvest, so that work could be shared and the village would not be overwhelmed. Such careful timing reduced waste and created rhythms that every household could depend on. Trade too began to follow gentler rules. Where once exchanges were casual, they evolved into steady patterns with agreed weights and measures. A standardized basket, a common unit for grain, eased barter and deepened trust between neighbors. Traders who arrived with beads from distant valleys or salted fish from the coast found themselves welcomed into a marketplace where promises were kept and debts repaid in due time. Even the acts of borrowing and lending were framed by custom. A loan carried an expectation of return in season. An owed meal was repaid with labor in the next harvest. In such a culture, contracts were not slick papers signed at a table but spoken commitments recorded by witnesses and marked on clay strips for memory. Stability encouraged longer projects. Stones were quarried with more careful planning. Roads were tamped to hold through rains. Bridges were built over seasonal streams to ease movement in wet months. These public works created not a spectacle but a pattern of shared responsibility. Neighbors would set aside a day to mend a wall, to shore up a bridge, to sweep the market so that it would be welcoming when traders came. Such labor was both practical and ceremonial. It bound people together by purpose, and the act of working side by side reinforced the social bonds that made order possible. In the slow rise of these projects, the village learned the value of planning and the quiet pride of lasting work. With this sense of common fate came institutions that were quiet rather than ornate. Councils met in arcaded spaces, their talk deliberate and often slow. Elders and those who had proven skill in matters of craft, weather or counsel, would take turns speaking and decisions were seldom rushed. In matters of dispute the emphasis was on repair rather than punishment. A quarrel over a boundary might be settled by a joint labor on the disputed land, a way to create value and reduce resentment in the same motion. Tribunals were workshops of reconciliation. A broken pot might be mended in the presence of those who argued, and the act of mending worked as both symbol and practical recompense. The religious practice of the people conformed to this order. Temples and shrines were places of measured devotion, built to house small sustaining rites. Priests were custodians of calendars and caretakers of shared memory. They marked dates of fasting and feasting, of sowing and of reaping, and their calendars threaded individual lives into the larger weave. Worship was quiet. Offerings were practical and modest. A portion of grain, a healed tool, a song. The rituals taught restraint and gratitude, insisting that nothing be taken without thought and that abundance be handled without waste. In the hush of these ceremonies, communities reinforced their sense of being part of a continuing cycle. Education followed the contours of usefulness. Children learned from elders the lines of work that sustained the community: how to mend a net, how to tend a sick neighbor, how to read the carved marks that recorded the year. Memory keepers taught apprentices the value of accuracy, the slow art of folding strips of clay into records and the patient decoding of chords knotted in sequence. Thus knowledge became distributed, not hoarded in one place, and the community possessed a resilience grown from shared competence. Learning took place on benches and at hearths. It was an apprenticeship in living as much as in skill. As craft advanced, an aesthetic order emerged that matched the practical. Architecture favored proportion and repetition. Houses were aligned to capture light at certain hours. Public buildings emphasized open courtyards that encouraged air and conversation. Ornament existed, but it was subdued. Geometric bands on a pot, a repeated motif in a weaving, an echo of the larger system of order reflected in small objects. Artisans who made these things adhered to standards passed across generations. In pottery, for instance, particular curves and thicknesses were prized because they kept food cooler. In weaving, certain knot patterns were used because they resisted wear. Beauty in this place was fused with use. The market's rhythm shaped social interaction. Mornings were often given to exchange, the fish gutted and laid out, the woven baskets full, the pots stacked for sale. Evenings belonged to storytelling and to shared meal. The marketplace and the hearth created two complementary orders, one outward-facing and mobile, the other inward-facing and intimate. Underneath both was a sense that the predictable repetition of small acts offered a sanctuary against chance. Routine itself calmed fear. Knowing what to expect, and seeing it fulfilled, allowed people to plan beyond the next day. Economy and ritual were knit together at moments of feasting. Harvest time produced occasions when the community would come together not only to divide the yield, but to celebrate the labor that had produced it. A modest festival might run 3 days, with rhythms of work and rest, music that repeated a slow refrain, and processions that moved deliberately through the lane. These gatherings kept the community's memory alive. They commemorated not only the crops but the stories of survival and the names of those who had taught the village how to bend and hold the land. In the slow procession of lanterns and the measured drum, the group reasserted itself as a single body. The age of order was not an absence of hardship. Floods still came, sometimes in patterns no one had expected. Disease walked unnoticed for a moon, and took families whose names are now only remembered in carved lists. Yet because the community had built patterns of support, the hard times were met not by collapse but by coordinated care. Quiet institutions of mutual aid, neighbors bringing grain, midwives carrying fireweed tea to a sick mother, softened the blows that misfortune could deliver. Order turned suffering into manageable episodes rather than fate that swallowed whole. Such networks of care were the kingdom's true reserve. This ethic extended to the governance of strangers. When travelers came, they were often put up in communal houses, where they would find food and a place to sleep. Travelers knew they would be asked for news and that their stories would enter the village's stores of knowledge. In return, they provided outside perspectives, different ways of drying fish, an improved knot for nets, news of a distant drought. The community treated these exchanges as stitches in a larger cloth, each stitch reinforcing the fabric rather than fraying it. As order deepened, so did the complexity of craft. Specialized guilds formed, not as monopolies but as circles of skill. Weavers gathered to refine patterns that economized thread, without diminishing beauty. Masons met to test different mortars. Smiths experimented with cooling methods that made nails less likely to bend. These small improvements increased the lifespan of tools and the yield of field. They also allowed for the emergence of an artisan class, whose identity was tied to craft excellence. Yet even this specialization remained embedded in communal life. A weaver's cloth served a household. A smith's plow aided a neighbor's harvest. Money began to be used for certain transactions. Simple tokens marked with a motif to indicate value circulated alongside barter. These tokens were not coins minted with sovereign faces, but practical reputations. A small stamped disc took the place of a common exchange for salt or grain. Their use simplified certain trades without replacing the deeper fabric of trust. People still preferred to settle debts by labor when possible. The coin was a convenience within a more patient society. Knowledge of the heavens played a growing role in the order of life. Stern but gentle, astronomers whose eyes were trained to patterns in the sky helped to predict the river's rise, and to time planting. They watched the moon and stars making notes on the first frost, and on the migration of birds. Their records, when set beside harvest yields, produced a practical calendar that reduced uncertainty. In a world where seasons mattered so much, this was a kind of magic grounded in observation, and it became a respected craft.
The age of order also made room for philosophy, not the loud dialectics of cities that would come later, but quiet reflections on the meaning of a good life. Teachers in the courtyards would pose questions in the evening. What is enough? How do we measure a life that has done its part? Answers were given in parables tied to daily work. A pot well made, a canal kept. The good life was a life that did not demand more of its neighbors than it could give. These conversations taught moderation and humility, virtues reinforced by the visible effects of practicing them. Even the laws of property and inheritance were shaped by the ethos of the age. They aimed to preserve continuity and to prevent concentration that might fracture the social fabric. Land passed chiefly within families, but provisions were made for those without kin. A childless couple might pass land to a trusted apprentice, or if no such person existed, the land would be divided among neighbors who would agree to care for it together. This practice maintained a balance between private attachment and communal responsibility, and kept the scales of wealth relatively even. Architecture served the needs of order, with public granaries built to ease famine, and with bathhouses that promoted health. Streets were planned not for grandeur, but for the measured flow of life, wide enough for a cart and for a market stall, narrow enough to maintain shade and intimacy. Public spaces were designed to invite conversation, to allow light and air to enter, and to reduce the sense that wealth could build impenetrable walls around itself. The built environment thus echoed the social order, modest, useful, and human. Yet beneath the surface smoothness of order, there remained seeds of impatience. Some desired more than steady rhythm. They wanted innovation for its own sake, a tower to mark a name, an opulent house to show skill. Such desires were watched with both curiosity and caution. The elders feared that excess might erode the balance they had so carefully cultivated. Small debates arose about when to allow private display and when to insist on modesty. For the most part, the community navigated these tensions by encouraging beauty that also served use, favoring ornament that protected a wall or shaded a market rather than mere ostentation. In their daily lives, gardens were planned with care, for fragrance and shade eased the work-worn eye. Musicians tuned simple strings and reed pipes, their slow melodies matching the pace of day. Music became a weather for the soul, setting mood more than showing off. Songs marked the turning of seasons and the coming of age. They named the work of hands and turned labor into ritual. Quiet collections of records appeared in alcoves and private rooms. These were not halls of endless scrolls, but modest places where strips of clay and folded fiber rested under careful hand. A child brought to such a nook might listen as an elder read a tale about drought, averted by patient planning. Keepers of memory were craftsmen in their own right, preserving names and measures so that the community might learn from its past. Trust formed an invisible economy. Promises mattered because reputation did. To break a pledge was to unweave part of the common cloth. This ethic made cooperative labor easier to arrange. Neighbors could be summoned to mend a bridge or harvest a field, and everyone knew the favor would find its return in time. The social cost of deceit was real. Less help in a hard season, less chance to borrow a pot when needed, and so honesty became practical as well as moral. Administration grew gently to meet new needs. Officials kept tallies on clay strips. Scribes developed marks that sped recording without losing truth. A steward checked waterworks between villages, resolving small quarrels before they widened. Their role was coordination, not coercion, and their authority rested on service. Markets linked the kingdom more widely. Local crafts, dye, pottery, smoked fish, traveled farther along a network of river paths and carts. The rulers of exchange favored moderation. Foreign goods were welcomed only while local artisans retained space to thrive. This policy kept the kingdom tasteful and distinct, admired by neighbors for its balance. With stability came a soft confidence. People assumed that a canal could be fixed, that a sick mother might receive care, that the records would hold a memory to conserve. This quiet assurance allowed imaginations to stretch. Poets found attentive listeners who could follow a line repeated until its meaning sank in. Artisans pursued finer work. Builders began to consider projects that were not merely useful, but beautiful. Thus the age of order folded daily care into a durable calm. It set the stage for a time when hands would reach higher, imagining temples and halls, motifs carved in stone that might speak to generations yet unborn. From this patient living, the builders of dreams would draw their tools and courage, and in doing so, would transform the order into an architecture of aspiration. In the age that followed order, hands began to move with a new confidence, and the breath of a people grew not only steadier, but more expansive. What had once been enough, the shelter, the kiln, the shared canal, now became the foundation upon which grander imaginings were laid. Builders rose from the quiet workbenches and fields. They were not strangers to the soil, but their eyes had learned a different map. They looked for proportion where once they had looked merely for shelter, for a curve that would catch the light in the early hours, for a doorway that might turn a threshold into a promise. The village that had organized itself into an enduring order now found itself dreaming aloud, and the dreams took the shape of stone and woven thread, of carved lintels and raised platforms that would hold song. These were practical dreams. A granary rounded so that wind would slide past rather than batter it. A bridge whose arc eased the strain on oxen and kept carts from tipping when laden. A market shed that let the rain fall gentle upon a sloped roof, while the air below remained dry. In each instance, function and form began to court each other, and in their courtship a new language developed. The mason's measure became as musical as the potter's wrist. The rhythm of the hammer struck a cadence that guided the eye as well as the hand. Utterly useful things acquired a dignity that made them more than tools. They became places where life took on a little more meaning. As confidence grew, so did the scale of endeavor. Builders and artisans took on projects that reached beyond daily necessity and into the realm of aspiration. A communal hall rose where once only a tamp-to-earth platform had existed. It was a place of slow columns and wide eaves that invited the moon to lay itself upon the roof in a thin, honest line. The hall was built to receive not only talk but the linger of memory. Its stones were chosen for how they softened the sound of a footfall, and how they warmed under human hand. It became a space where ceremonies could unspool with dignity, where weddings and funerals found a frame that felt both modest and lasting. Temples and shrines followed a similar logic. Where once a field had a flat stone to turn to for offerings, now rose small oblong temples where light could be directed with intent. Architects learned to open courtyards to sky so that sunlight could enter in measured stripes, illuminating certain carvings at particular hours. These places were crafted to hold attention and to slow it, to make the act of worship itself feel like the deepening of breath. In the making of sacred space, artisans discovered a language of shadow and light, how a column's curve could suggest a palm, how a carved band of waves might mimic the sound of the river. Devotion and design became intertwined. Built forms did not merely host ritual, they taught. Masonry advanced through patient experiment. Lime and crushed stone were mixed with proportions tested by elders and adjusted by sons, who watched the mortar dry. Foundations were sunk deeper, and arches learned to bear weight in a way that turned force into beauty. The Masons' Guild formed as a circle of shared craftsmanship. They spoke to each other in the precise grammar of measure, and apprentices sat for years learning the small patience required to make a wall that would not heave with the wet season. Stone cutters developed systems of joining that required no glue but fit like the close fold of a palm. With each improvement, the buildings rose truer, and the public spaces became more enduring. Carpentry found its own voice. Wood was not only used for roofs and doors but for subtle interior shapes that guided movement through rooms. Carved lintels, once plain, began to bear motifs of birds in flight or the slow spirals of river eddy. Joinery grew precise, so that doors swung without friction, and windows shut with a satisfying hush. When wood met stone in a well-made frame, the contrast amplified the qualities of each material, the warmth of timber beside the cool solidity of carved stone. Doors became thresholds intentionally designed to announce arrival and invitation. In the long evenings, the scent of sawdust mingled with the smoke of hearths, and the hum of work sounded like a soft chorus. Pottery and textiles enjoyed their renaissance. Potters experimented with kilns that held heat more evenly and clays tempered with ash to increase durability. Shapes diversified, large storage jars with narrow necks to protect grains, low bowls with flared rims, suited to communal eating, delicate cups whose thinness made tea feel like a warm thought on the tongue. Exterior glazes were refined, and patterns were applied in repeated bands, so that when pots stood in a row they sang together, like chimes. Weavers likewise developed complex patterns that encoded stories. A band might tell of a season, a warp thread might mark the birth of a child. Cloth became memory and status in a way that still served use. Woven blankets were both warm and instructive, instructing the young on the order of lineage and the rhythm of festivals. Sculptors took small liberties not for vanity but for the telling of identity. Figures carved in small alcoves did not demand worship like idols, but registered the presence of ancestors with restraint. Reliefs were composed to suggest motion rather than fix it. A farmer bent in relief seemed to be still sowing, because the frieze caught a single gesture repeated, a time condensed. These images functioned like a slow encyclopedia, small teachings that reinforced the habit of living. Sow carefully, mend daily, honor the river. Public imagery instructed without sermonizing, reminding passers-by through gentle repetition of what mattered. Gardens gained new attention. Landscape design was not an act of domination, but a manner of framing what the land already offered. Raised beds were bordered with stone carved with shallow channels that guided overflow to thirsty plants. Shade trees were planted in regular intervals to cool streets as they matured. Water features were engineered to reflect the moon and make its light appear doubled, as if the heavens had joined the civil design. Gardens became places of conversation and study, where herbalists taught apprentices the differences between leaves that would soothe and those that would sever. In these green rooms, artisans and elders sat together and spoke of proportion and care, their conversations followed by the quiet rustle of leaves. Public art and architecture began to gather the community into a shared rhythm. Processional ways were paved so that during seasonal rites the whole town might move as one body, lanterns swinging like low stars. Pavilions were raised at crossroads as spaces for storytellers,
their columns carved with repeating elements that tuned the eye to the cadence of a tale. The city, once a clustered arrangement of homes and ovens, took on a composure that directed movement and attention. People walked through their days as through a cultivated landscape, their steps informed by thresholds, by squares, by slow converging axes that led them toward the communal center. The builders were not only masons and carpenters but also planners. They learned to consider circulation, how water would pass through streets in heavy rains, where market stalls would best be placed to avoid overflow, how waste would be carried away. They designed drainage and cisterns with a foresight that conserved water in lean years and prevented rot in wet seasons. Their planning was pragmatic, measured by the knowledge of seasons, but it carried an aesthetic sensibility. A street that shed water gracefully was also a street where dust would be less, where small children could play without mud. Thus the practical and the pleasurable met in design choice. Guilds and workshops flourished as centers of apprenticeship and critique. Junior artisans learned not only skill but the ethics of proportion. Masters taught apprentices to see the bias of light and how a corner could either invite or close. Critique sessions were soft, hands lifted instead of voices raised, but they formed a tradition of revision. A pot might be remade 3 or 4 times, each iteration refining a curve until it both fit the hand and expressed a simple, clear beauty. The culture cultivated not perfection for show but refinement for life. With refinement came patronage, small at first and then more organized. Families who had long served the community might sponsor a lane to be paved or a small shrine to be repaired. These acts of giving were not competitive displays of vanity but investments in the common fabric. A family who paid for a well expected only that the well be well maintained. The reward was social stability rather than ostentation. Over time, a few houses acquired slightly more elaborate ornamentation, a carved balcony here, a tiled niche there, but these were generally integrated into the town's rhythm, not set apart in exclusion. Learning traveled with the built form. As a town displayed a refined bridge or a well-proportioned hall, visitors came to see and to learn. Apprentices from neighboring settlements sought out workshops to learn stone dress and the subtleties of arching. This exchange propagated techniques and created a regional vernacular of form, a way of building that marked these people not by the sheer scale of their works but by their taste and restraint. Across the river valleys, a recognizable style spread, an economy of detail that was both efficient and graceful. Religious architecture absorbed much of this refinement, but it did so with care. Temples were designed to be humble teachers rather than towering claims. A temple might include a small cloister where children could trace the rhythm of prayer by copying curved motifs etched in low relief. This pedagogy made form a part of instruction. Young hands learned proportion by tracing stone, and in that learning the next generation inherited not just craft but sensibility. The language of ornament expanded into civic symbolism. A repeated band on public cisterns signaled the trust of water-sharing agreements. Particular carved motifs over doors indicated that a household had been designated as a place of refuge during storm. Thus design became communicative. A carved mark conveyed a civic function as easily as a written notice. The city itself became a gentle book of signs that a literate and observant inhabitant could read with ease. In the quiet of construction, the rhythm of life found new metaphors. Builders worked slowly, measuring twice and cutting once. Their ways taught patience to apprentices who would then carry that patience into the governance of canals and the making of law. The act of building taught collaboration. For heavy stones required many hands. The lifting sorted roles and taught leadership by service. The structures that rose out of these efforts embodied the virtues that had held the community through earlier ages: rectitude, utility, patience. As structures multiplied, so did the rituals connected to them. A bridge might have an annual cleansing where the community would walk its length and toss small offerings into the water to thank gravity for its service. A public oven might be blessed on the first day of winter, its hearth stoked by the elder who had first taught the village how to regulate heat. These rituals reinforced the sense that built forms were not mere objects but living parts of a community, things that required tending and thought. Yet with the rise of grander works came questions. Who decided which project to undertake? When a lane required paving, who allocated labor? The elders' council often mediated such questions, balancing perceived need against the cost of resource and labor. Sometimes tension surfaced. Families who wanted more ornate homes argued with those who wished to divert resources to irrigation. The community navigated these debates by appealing to long-standing principles. Communal need first, ornamented excess only when it clearly served the common good. This ethic did not eliminate disagreement, but it made it manageable. The builders of dreams then, were not dreamers in the fanciful sense but artists of purpose. They shaped spaces where life could deepen. For a while the town glowed like a carefully lit lantern, soft, intentional, and full of human warmth. Structures rose not to impress a distant eye but to make daily existence more dignified, more thoughtful. As houses took on refined details and public spaces acquired quiet grandeur, people learned to move through life with a sense of design that was mirrored in behavior. The built world began to instruct the human one: measure twice, speak once, tend the canal before planting, set the pot so it will dry evenly. Such lessons would echo in coming ages, when wealth and ambition would press against restraint. For now, however, the town sat balanced between utility and grace, held together by the steady hands of those who made dreams into usable, lasting shape. In the gentle arc of time, there arrives a season when steadiness turns luminous. Where once the people tended canals and wove cloth with careful hands, now their days gathered a different light, one that gilded commonplace things and made small comforts seem like the glow of distant dawn. They called this passage, without haste and without need to name it loudly, the Age of Gold. It was not a single moment but a measured becoming, an accumulation of skill and trust that allowed more than bare survival. The fields yielded well, the stores filled in good measure, and the lamps in kitchen courtyards burned long into the evening, as families spoke in softer tones and the market moved with the ease of a well-practiced ritual. Prosperity first revealed itself in the rhythm of plenty. Granaries once stacked in modest rows now rose a little higher, their mouths sealed with care so that weevils found no harbor. The surplus allowed households to set aside stores for lean years, and to welcome travelers without anxiety. Where a household might once have bartered bread for a pot, it could now offer coin-like tokens that smoothed exchange, and let a potter plan a kiln firing, without immediate fear. This predictability relaxed the everyday tension that had once shaped every choice. People found themselves with the luxury of attention, to finish a carving, without fear of needing the wood for fire next week, to experiment with glazing, to teach a child to read the marks on a clay strip instead of sending them at once to tend the field. Markets grew in scale and in the variety of goods that moved upon them. Fish salted and smoked to last found new customers. Cloth dyed with richer colors, deep indigos and soft ochres, hung like banners in shop niches. Small luxuries arrived from distant valleys, carried along trade routes by careful men who knew the long ways of river and road. Evenings held more music and stories, for when men were not scraping for the next meal, they could tune their instruments and let songs extend beyond the utilitarian. A potter's son might learn a reed flute, a weaver's daughter might listen to the telling of a traveler's tale of mountains beyond the mapped hills. The additional hours bred refinement, and a certain generous curiosity. Public works found new patrons. Where once a lane was tamped as an emergency, now it might be paved for comfort. A communal well might be deepened, its circular stone rim shaped with care so that when the moonlight fell, it lay like a silver coin in the town's heart. Bridges were rebuilt on sturdier arches, plazas were edged with low benches that invited rest and conversation, and modest fountains were added to public squares to cool the air and create a place for neighbors to meet. These projects did not aim at grandeur for its own sake. They were chosen to ease life and to make the town more inviting to the stranger, and kinder to the aging. In each improvement there was an ethic: make what you build last and make it serve many. The Age of Gold also encouraged a flowering of craft beyond mere utility. Artisans freed from the immediate anxieties of subsistence nurtured subtler forms. Clay vessels gained more careful glazes and patterns that told stories not only of lineage but of seasons, and the quiet laws of living with the land. Weavers introduced motifs that spoke of river currents, and the arc of the moon, and in certain households cloths were woven with bands, indicating birth years, and remembered names. Carpentry reached for polish and finish that made doors feel like the opening of a promise rather than a barrier. Jewelry of modest preciousness, small rings, and pin-like ornaments, appeared in careful hands, worn mostly by those whose trade required travel, and thus served as both adornment and a kind of passport. Trade routes widened, and with them came a soft cosmopolitanism. Traders who had once passed like weather now lingered with more frequency, bringing news and ideas. They carried not only goods but techniques, a dyeing method that fixed color better, a kiln design that conserved fuel, a joinery trick that made shutters close more quiet. The town's artisans adopted what proved useful, and left the rest to other soils. This selective borrowing created a local style that was both distinctive and capable of slight evolution. Neighbors admired each other's designs and occasionally borrowed a motif, integrating it into their own vocabulary of form. This exchange knit the region into a more cohesive culture of practice. Institutions matured along with material comfort. Councils that had once met to arbitrate small disputes now found themselves managing more complex arrangements. The scheduling of trade fairs, the oversight of shared granaries, the allocation of labor for public repair. A steward was appointed to keep finer tallies of stores that had once rested in the elders' memories. Scribes noted the movement of goods and the promises of traders so that debts and credits held in a common ledger could be consulted. Administration grew modestly, its growth guided by necessity rather than ambition, but it allowed the community to operate with greater confidence over longer spans of time. The Age of Gold also bore in itself the gentle shadow of new desire. Where modest wealth had allowed for communal improvements, it also created temptations for private accumulation. Some households, through luck or shrewdness, accumulated more than others. A family that had access to a favored trade route might display slightly richer cloths, or a potter whose glaze delighted might earn more tokens. With accumulation came the soft beginnings of distinction. Houses occasionally acquired more elaborate carved niches. A balcony might boast tiles of a deeper blue. These were not, in most cases, garish displays. Rather, they were slow signs of differentiation, like a twig that grows a few leaves more than its neighbors. Such differences were largely tolerated, and often admired for a time, because they indicated the health of craft and trade. But they required careful social management. The elders and the council tended to remind the community that public good was not to be sacrificed for private vanity. When a prosperous family suggested funding the paving of a lane only to do so with a carved symbol that made their mark prominent, debate would follow. The common expectation, kept alive by ritual and by custom, was that benefactors offer improvements without claiming them as exclusive property. Gifts were to be given in humility, with the understanding that the community might name the well for the common good, rather than for a single house. Festivals grew richer in the Age of Gold. Harvest gatherings extended into multi-day events, where shared plates, music and processions allowed people to savor the town's bounty together. Clay bowls passed from hand to hand in slow rotation, songs layered upon one another, until the air seemed to hum with collective memory. Children were given special parts in the ceremonies, carrying small lanterns, reciting simple lines learned by heart, so that the ethos of public sharing was taught early. At night, the processions would move through the town as a single extended body of light. The well-lit streets and the paved plazas framed the ritual in such a way that both the visible and the invisible were honored. This era saw the refinement of legal thought as well. Agreements that had once been spoken and witnessed were supplemented by written tallies, and by a practice of notarizing certain promises for important matters. The written record did not replace oral memory, but supported it where the scale of exchange required more durable documentation. Property transfers were recorded with care. A loan for a trader's canoe might be registered, so that future disputes would be resolved with reference to a common memory. The law, as it matured, tended to preserve the balance between private initiative and communal welfare. Health and hygiene received increased attention as well. The Age of Gold allowed the community to invest in shared bathhouses and in better sanitation in public spaces. A drained swamp was turned into a garden, a stagnant pool was covered and piped to a cistern for the town's use. Midwives and herbalists gained stature as their practical knowledge reduced the toll of certain ailments. Not all disease vanished. Illness was still part of life, but the capacity to respond improved. The community realized that the preservation of health was as crucial to prosperity as the accumulation of stores. Education also benefited. The modest scribal practice grew into more systematic instruction for those who would become keepers of memory, or traders who needed to read ledger. Children who showed aptitude were sometimes apprenticed to a scribe or an artisan, who would teach them forms of calculation and craft that enabled them to travel with traders, or to manage more complex work. Literacy remained limited, but where it existed, it served a practical purpose, and fostered a class of skilled coordinators who could steward the larger enterprise of urban life. The spiritual life of the town adjusted to these material changes. Rituals that had once sufficed for a less complex society took on new forms to answer questions raised by prosperity. How should surplus be used? How must wealth be displayed, if at all? The temples and shrines provided councils where such questions could be addressed. The priests and keepers of tradition taught that abundance was a test of temperance, and that ultimate value lay in the maintenance of relationships, not in the accumulation of goods. Sermons, if they can be called such in a place of measured piety, urged moderation, and the honoring of past agreements, and they often found receptive ears. With prosperity came a new mobility of people. Young artisans who had mastered skills found themselves in demand in neighboring towns. Traders' sons often learned to navigate adjacent regions, taking with them techniques of craft and ways of thinking. This mobility knitted the region more tightly. It also created new possibilities for marriage, alliance, and cultural exchange. The town that had once seemed a self-contained cluster of interdependent households now felt part of a broader web. The exchange of ideas and techniques reinforced the local style, while allowing for gradual innovation. Despite the many blessings of the Age of Gold, the community could feel the slow advancement of change, like the approach of a distant tide. Affluence brought edges of complexity that required new judgments and vigilance. The elders, now older and experienced in balancing public good with private initiative, often took pains to teach the young that prosperity was not an end, but a responsibility. They reminded the town that the ease of today would not guarantee the ease of tomorrow, unless care continued in the ways of management and in the habits of moderation.
There is a hush that comes at the meeting point of success and desire. The Age of Gold was that hush made visible. Streets paved with careful hands, lamps burning longer, songs extended into the night, kitchens that could afford more varied spices. It was in many ways a gentle and generous time, one that allowed for the quiet pleasures of finished work and thoughtful ornament. But it was also a time when the choices of a few could ripple outward, where accumulation left unchecked might pull at the fragile balance woven over generations. The town shone because of the care it had taken to be wise. It would remain to be seen whether wisdom could keep pace with the luminous temptation of gold. There is a delicate hour when sunlight lingers, and the air carries the warmth of a day that will soon be folded into night. It is in such an hour that desire first makes itself known, not as thunder or roar, but as a slight lengthening of a glance, a thought that lingers where once attention was wholly practical. Desire, benign at first, grows like a reed in quiet water, slow and almost unnoticed until its shadow spreads across the surface. In this kingdom, long nourished by careful order and the gentle glow of prosperity, the shadow of desire arrived softly, like a dust motes drifting across a lamp, and with that drifting came new shapes to the life the people knew. The change began in private detail. A potter, whose glazes had always been chosen for sturdiness, experimented with a deeper blue that asked for more fuel and more time at the kiln. The result was a cup that made tea taste more sacred, simply because the cup was pleasing to hold. A weaver, freed by surplus, began to braid threads into denser patterns that carried not only warmth, but a subtle statement of difference. A merchant who had once been content to trade barley found a more lucrative path in importing a rare spice, whose scent could be dripped sparingly into a broth and make an ordinary meal feel like a season of feasts. Each small change was in itself harmless and even admirable, yet together they formed a new grammar. Things could be refined beyond need into markers of taste, and quietly of rank. The social ripples of such private refinement are slow but real. When a family displayed a blue cup that took longer to make, neighbors admired it and perhaps coveted the method. When a weaver's cloth drew eyes for its pattern, another household might hope for the same distinction. Desire tends to seek not only possession, but also the recognition that comes with it. The more visible the refinements became, the more they shaped the daily perceptions of what counted as good. This shifting of values did not happen overnight. It was threaded through seasons of conversation at courtyards, and through the seesaw of praise and polite envy that is native to small communities. In markets, talk began to carry not only need but preference. Traders noted that certain wares fetched more tokens, and began to favor those routes that richest returns promised. Where before the merchant's ledger might have listed fish and salt, now entries sometimes recorded small luxuries bought with extra coin. The ledger, while still a practical instrument, began to include margins and surpluses that fed an economy of want. This economy did not replace the older structures of mutual aid, but it introduced a parallel path, where wealth could be converted into visible difference: richer cloth, wider doorways, slightly more ornate niches above thresholds. The elders saw these patterns with a slow, careful concern. They had not opposed beauty or refinement. Indeed, many had encouraged the arts that made the town more gracious. Their concern lay in the subtle reordering of priorities. When ornament demanded disproportionate resources, the shared work that sustained irrigation and granaries might be neglected. A kiln firing that consumed extra wood for a single artisan's glaze might be insignificant alone, but if many chose similar indulgences, the cumulative cost could be felt in the communal store. The elders understood scarcity not as a distant theory, but as the lived fact of seasons, and their cant was to remind people that delight should not outstrip the common good. Temples and shrines, once a place to frame restraint and gratitude, found themselves in a gentle struggle with desire's shifting taste. Offerings had long been small and practical, a portion of grain, a mended tool. Gradually, gifts grew in elaboration. Plates of spiced rice, baskets woven with gold-flecked thread, small ornaments made from rare shell. These signaled devotion, but also subtly marked the giver's status. Priests and custodians of ritual noticed how the language of gift changed. Humility, once the heart of offering, risked being replaced by a quest for recognition. Sermons and counsels took on a new tenor. Keepers of tradition urged worshippers to remember the essence of giving, while acknowledging the natural human urge to mark life's occasions with beauty. Politics too began to feel the pull. The steward who oversaw public works found it harder to secure labor for communal projects when some hands were tempted by better pay, offered by a private patron to finish an ornate house faster. The balance that had once gathered the village toward common tasks needed reminders and reweave. Agreements that were once easily kept now required more negotiation. The soft economy of favors found itself contending with tokens and the wages those tokens bought. The elders' council, accustomed to mediating small disputes, found its work deepening into the realm of normative argument. Should a benefactor be allowed to place a prominent mark on a public well if the coin came with conditions? The debates that followed were rarely loud. They were threaded conversations in which the community tested the limits of generosity and asked whether private gain should come with public cost. Where desire sharpened most keenly was in estates that had grown prosperous through trade and craft. With surplus, certain houses extended their courtyards, placed carved niches with finer detail, or requested tiles of a deeper color not easily produced by local artisans. These expansions did not necessarily harm communal life, but they did begin to produce a sense that some lives commanded more attention. As houses subtly differentiated, social mobility, once modest and primarily craft-based, began to take on different form. Marriage, once an instrument of joining families and skills, now sometimes included considerations of standing, of whether a match would elevate a household's visibility as much as its capability. This reweaving of social fabric happened gently, with both generous and anxious steps. Those who acquired more soon felt a new responsibility to give back in ways that would not flaunt their wealth. Many did so with grace, funding the paving of a lane or sponsoring a communal kiln. Yet human vanity and the desire to be remembered can do strange things to intention. It is one thing to contribute a well with no name attached. It is another to fund it with the condition that a plaque be set above its rim, dutifully polished so every passerby would see the donor's emblem. Small acts like these are often rationalized as practical. They ensure maintenance through a named responsibility, but they also reframe generosity as a transaction that enhances reputation. Economic practices changed accordingly. Tokens and credited accounts, once instruments of convenience, became ledgers that revealed a household's capacity to build and to sponsor. Merchants who handled routes began to store records not only of trade, but of favors and loans, an informal web of obligations that could be called upon in times of need. Where previously the moral economy kept debts visible to neighbors through common memory, now certain debts were mediated through scribes and written records, less public and more formal. This shift made some things more efficient, but also less transparent. Obligations could be arranged in ways that were not immediately visible to everyone, and that opacity sometimes bred suspicion. In other corners, desire took the form of cultural prestige. A scholar might produce a finely written roll with thin, elegant script and sell it to a private patron who would keep it as a mark of cultivation. A teacher who once taught common knowledge publicly might be commissioned to instruct in a closed setting for those who could pay. Thus learning, always valued, began to stratify gently. Knowledge was still often shared, but the more costly and specialized forms, technical mastery, rare herbs, precise uses,
the craft of record-making could be sequestered to those who could afford them. The elders worried that this stratification might erode the community's resilience, which had always depended on wide distribution of practical skill. The rhetoric of desire also entered marriage custom. Arranged unions, long negotiated for the sake of cooperation and balance of skills, were sometimes influenced by the hope of aligning with a household of greater means. This change did not erase the qualities that had once been most important: skill, willingness to labor, temperament, but it did add a new criterion advantage. It made alliances more strategic and the currency of marriage partially economic. For some this offered an opportunity, for others it felt like a narrowing of a once broader way of social interchange. A quieter but no less potent change lay in the aspirations of young people, seeing the more ornate houses and the blue-glazed cups. Sometimes dreamed of lives that would carry their names beyond the valley. They listened more attentively to traders' tales of cities where one might achieve renown. Such dreams could be benign, fuel for a potter to refine craft, for a weaver to learn a new pattern, but they could also become impatient. Where once patience and steady apprenticeship sufficed, the lure of quick recognition, of an ornament that declared talent, tempted the impatient heart into risky ventures. Importantly, desire did not spread as a uniform disease. Many households remained anchored in the older ethic of sufficiency and mutual dependence. They measured themselves by the capacity to sustain kin and neighbors rather than by tokens and visible markers. Yet even within such households the shadow of desire could appear in small, almost comic ways. A neighbor's slightly shinier ewer noticed and admired, a festival dish compared with that of another family and found wanting. These moments were human and ordinary, not villainous, and they remind us that desire is part of the texture of community life, sometimes generative, sometimes corrosive. Over time, the community developed adaptive responses. Custom and law adjusted to new conditions. The elder council sometimes required that public improvements be named for the community rather than for an individual, and they codified practices about how benefactions should be made, preferring anonymous labor or gifts that required the donor to contribute hands-on rather than merely coin. Guilds instituted rules about apprenticeship and the public display of certain techniques, in part to keep craft knowledge circulating. Religious custodians emphasized the ethic of humility and the spiritual value of restraint. In short, institutions sought to hold desire in balance by shaping channels through which private wealth could serve the public without allowing private display to overbear community life. Still, the shadow of desire once cast alters light in ways that are not easily undone. It lengthens some evenings, as the mind lingers over possibilities. It sharpens negotiations in councils and tempers songs at feasts with an undercurrent of comparison. It introduces a new complexity to relations of exchange, replacing some of the older, plainly visible debts of trust with written obligations and private favors. This complexity makes governance heavier. It requires more attention and a more delicate hand to maintain fairness. At the heart of the matter, the kingdom struggled not with greed as a monstrous force but with a subtle rearrangement of priorities. The same impulse that produced beauty and refinement could also pull focus away from simpler commitment. What was needed was a renewed practice of moderation, rituals, laws, and everyday habits that reminded people of what had sustained them: shared canals, the rotation of labor, the keeping of seasons in memory, and the ethic of mutual aid. The elders, the priests, the guilds, and the families themselves all took part in this slow project of reweaving, each using their own tools: sermons, statutes, apprenticeship rules, public pledges, to remind the community of its foundational value. Yet beneath these practical responses there lived a quieter reckoning, private and reflective. People who had watched the town grow asked themselves what it meant to have beauty without losing the discipline that had made beauty possible. In low voices by the lamp, they taught children songs that cautioned against desire that consumes, not for moralizing's sake but because they understood how quickly an unbalanced appetite weakened the cords of mutual aid. Parents would tell tales of households that had once hoarded and seen their walls crack in winter for want of shared labor, or of potters who lost their craft to vanity. The parables served as small corrections, not harsh judgments, and they helped to form a cultural memory of restraint. Still, the era carried a bittersweet quality. The age of gold had brought ease and the chance for subtlety. Crafts deepened, public works improved, and the town glowed in many soft ways. Yet the shadow of desire taught a careful lesson, that any increase in wealth invites a choice. One path leads to generosity that sustains and beautifies the common life. The other slips into distinctions that erode communal bonds. The kingdom found itself at a hinge, where wisdom and vigilance would determine whether desire would become a source of richer life, or the first whisper of division. In this delicate balance lay the seeds of the next age, one where pride, not merely hunger, would test the bonds that had held the people so gently together. There comes a turning in every long story when collections of small choices, like pebbles pushed down a slope, finally find their movement and roll toward a single place. The kingdom that had for so long tended its canals and sung its measured songs began to feel such a It was not a single dramatic stroke that broke the peace, but a pattern of decisions, soft, practical at their edges, that aggregated into something sharper. The broken crown did not fall from the sky, it cracked from within, as governance and custom, pride and desire, found themselves at odds with one another. In the gentle way of things that weather slowly, the heart of the polity showed its fissures. At first the fissures were small and private. A steward, weary from balancing shifting accounts, misjudged a season and promised too many laborers for an ornate house. A guild, eager to preserve its prestige, tightened rules in a way that excluded a gifted apprentice, who could not afford due. These were acts made from motives that were not cruel, sometimes from fatigue, sometimes from a desire to protect quality, but they signaled a narrowing of the generous circles that had once defined the community. When persons who had once freely contributed their hands and knowledge felt the cost of doing so increase, they began to withhold in small ways. The habit of public giving frayed at its edges. Leadership felt the strain most keenly. Those appointed to steward the common good had long relied on the soft currency of reputation and the force of example. Now they faced more complex challenges, written debts that could not easily be resolved in public squares, litigated disputes over land with neighbors who had once been close kin, and the slow politicization of resources that had always been shared. Where once decisions could be made by consensus, controversy now required judgment that could not be reached by gentle conversation alone. The council found itself dividing into wings, some who insisted on strict adherence to long-held communal norms, others who argued for pragmatic accommodations to new wealth and new pressure. The harmony that once allowed a single voice to rise and be respected began to break into competing notes. A hallmark of the fracture was the change in how justice and recompense were seen. In the earlier ages, when a neighbor's wall collapsed or a field was accidentally trampled, repair and restitution were arranged as practical fixes, labor shared, stones replaced, a meal offered to settle a heart. Now, as ledgers and tokens made obligations more precise and private contracts multiplied, disputes were treated as matters of right more than of restoration. Suits were brought, witnesses consulted, and the public resolution that had reconciled many a hard feeling became rarer. The act of restoring balance, once imbued with a moral softness, hardened into procedures that often left resentment unsoothed. The courts themselves changed tone. A body that had once aimed to make amends now increasingly enforced agreements in ways that left social scars. When a merchant who had accepted a loan failed to deliver, the ledger allowed a harsh claim. Labor might be sequestered, small plots of land pledged. The penalties, though not excessive by any remote standard, carried the sting of public loss. Families who had depended on customary leniency found themselves facing mechanisms designed for an economy with less mutual familiarity. Procedural fairness did not always translate into communal healing. Economic stratification deepened the fracture. Households that had acquired accumulated goods, shops with wider niches, storerooms that held more grain, began to deploy their resources in ways that set them apart. Some invested in public goods, and in those cases, the town benefited. Others chose to convert surplus into private comfort, tiled private baths, slightly larger courtyards, hired keepers for storerooms so the family could travel. The latter choices shifted labor expectations and reduced the pool of shared hands for collective tasks. When the rains were forecast, and an emergency canal clearing was needed, the call for neighbors to come together found fewer hands able or willing to spare a day. The civic muscle that had been exercised for generations weakened. Corruption is often imagined as a loud theft, visible and dramatic. In this kingdom it arrived more like a slow leak, hard to notice at first, because it came dressed in familiar clothes. A contract might be quietly arranged in a private corner, whereby a steward allowed favorable terms to a relative in exchange for a small token. A guild leader might accept a gift of rare dye and in turn favor that donor's cloth at market. These small reciprocities, when isolated, seemed like acts of hospitality or gratitude. In aggregate they altered fairness, The trust that goods and favors would circulate equitably eroded as some found access easier than others. Where equality of access had once been a social fact, it became a negotiation. The temple precincts felt the change. While many priests and custodians remained humble, there were instances where ritual officiants accepted more lavish gifts, and quietly permitted commemorations that exalted family names. A shrine that had once been a place of quiet offering, now bore plaques and niches that made the donor's presence permanent. The sacred language of modesty, which had taught the value of giving without display, found itself contending with displays that claimed status through devotion. Tension followed as some worshippers inwardly resented the visible honors, and priests worried that ritual would lose its moral center. Public resentment brewed not as a dramatic uprising, but as a murmuring that gathered steam in courtyards and by the well. It took the shape of stories told at night, stories of a household that refused to send labor in a year of need, of a trader who had silently raised prices when supply tightened, of a steward who preferred written agreements to the old practice of reconciliation. The rhetoric of grievance was careful at first, delivered as sides over bread, but when repeated, such narratives shaped perceptions. The social imagination began to imagine a class of insiders and outsiders, and that imagined division exerted its own force. Ambition among certain young men and women sharpened into something that did not always serve the community. Where previous generations viewed prestige as a trust to be exercised in tempering wealth, some now pursued honor for its spectacle. Towers that had been considered unnecessary were proposed as markers of family name. A merchant sought to sponsor a festival, not merely to fund civic joy, but to set his house apart. These projects generated labor and required resources that might otherwise have tended canals or granaries. The council faced choices it had rarely encountered: how to weigh a family's desire for a legacy against the community's pressing needs. Foreign relations added another layer of strain. The town's increasing visibility attracted traders and envoys from fatherland. With them came offers of partnership and competition. Foreign merchants sometimes offered credit for goods that allowed certain households to amplify their standing quickly. While such exchange enriched the town, it also introduced new debts and entanglement. A foreign agreement might promise to bring a plentiful dye, but required exclusive trade for a season, shutting out other local traders. These bargains, attractive to ambitious households, threatened the equilibrium. The council grappled with whether to restrict such partnerships or to allow them with safeguards. There were no easy answers. Military considerations, hitherto peripheral to daily life, began to surface as well. As neighboring regions noticed the town's prosperity, envoys arrived not only with wares, but with subtle demands for tribute or alliance. Some leaders in the town urged the strengthening of defenses, not from a place of fear, but as prudence, arguing that a modest levy to maintain watchmen would protect the markets and the canals. Others saw this as another avenue for the concentration of resources. Who would command such a force, and would its leaders become instruments of private power? The prospect of armed men patrolling the lanes troubled many. The memory of how fragile public trust had become made people wary of any instrument that might be used to enforce private advantage. The education of youth shifted as well. As the economy specialized and rewards for certain skills rose, apprenticeships favored those with means. A child from a modest household might find fewer opportunities to master a coveted craft, because guild dues and private sponsorships had become necessary steps in training. The widening gap in access to instruction bred resentment in some quarters, and a sense of unfairness that would take time to heal. Those left behind sometimes turned their energies towards small rebellions of disregard, work done half-heartedly, feasts attended with less warmth, songs sung more sparsely. The social glue thinned in places. Fissures in kinship relations revealed themselves too. Marriage arrangements, once a means of strengthening communal ties through skill sharing, now sometimes included clauses about dowries and material expectations that strained older customs. Families negotiated in matches with an eye to the household's economic future, rather than to the mutual aid that had held groups together through drought. This pragmatic turn was not entirely malign. Sometimes it secured resources that helped a family survive. But as the practice became widespread, the network of reciprocal obligation that marriage had traditionally reinforced shifted toward a calculus of advantage. As the cracks widened, rumor and suspicion performed a corrosive work. Where earlier missteps had been corrected through public acknowledgement and repair, now accusations sometimes took life without investigation. The written medium that had once supported trade could be used to manufacture claims or obscure debt. A ledger might be altered, an account might be kept private. The elders, who had been the steady keepers of communal norms, found their moral authority challenged by a new layer of formal records that could be manipulated by those who knew the marks and had the resources to wield them. Resistance to the new patterns emerged in different forms. Some groups insisted on returning to the old ways of shared labor and public reconciliation, organizing voluntary brigades to mend canals without recourse to payment. Others sought to codify protections against predatory bargains, drafting clearer ordinances about foreign trade and the responsibilities of donors. Guilds reasserted public apprenticeship quotas to ensure wider access to craft instruction. Temple custodians revived teachings about humility and the perils of display. These measures stemmed the tide in parts, but they could not fully reverse the cumulative effects of years of subtle change. Repair came, but it required effort and sacrifice. The broken crown became a metaphor among those who discussed the matter quietly, a symbol for leadership that had lost its capacity to hold. A crown suggests a focal point, a place where responsibility is concentrated, and when that place fractures, the structure it supports wobbles. In this kingdom, the crown was rarely a physical object. It was a trust, the accepted balance between private interest and public duty. In the years leading to the break, the crown had been worn by many: elders, stewards, guild leaders, temple custodians. Each contributed to maintaining the fabric. As each role bent under new stresses, desire, foreign entanglement, legal formalism, the crown split into fragments carried by competing hands. The community did not fall into chaos at once. The old bonds retained a great deal of resilience. Neighbors continued to tend to one another in many ordinary and vital ways, yet the cracks allowed resentments to fester in corners, and small conflicts catalyzed broader distrust. The first overt instances of division, an extended strike by laborers, demanding fairer pay, a contested election of a steward, a public dispute over inheritance, felt less like ruptures, and more like the slow work of a wound open. These events marked the transition from quiet corrosion to visible conflict. They were the first visible signs that the crown had lost its seamlessness, and that the kingdom would now begin to confront the necessity of change, and with it, loss. In the hush before that change, people looked up at the moon and wondered whether the light would continue to hold their days together. When small fissures widen, the quiet that once covered 100 small acts of care begins to thin. The town that had leaned on canals and crafted halls now found itself under a sky that felt less hospitable, as if the moon's patience had been tested. The storm did not arrive like a single night of thunder. It gathered in stages, a slow confluence of decisions, resentments, and misjudged merits, that together formed winds capable of rearranging lives. The first gusts were local, labor withheld, prices rising in a narrow market, a quarrel left to cool until it grew hot enough to mar a neighbor's name. These small tempests, when unattended, multiplied. They called to one another across courtyards, and then, without clearly defined herald, the larger storm began. People noticed that sounds lengthened. Where footsteps had once signaled arrival with the ease of recognition, they now carried an edge of caution, a sense that a familiar gait might mask intent. Conversations, once easy and flowing, turned clear. At the market, buyers paused longer, reading not only the weight of grain, but the expression behind the trader's hand. The steward's calls for coordinated labor met with fewer volunteers, and more quibbles about fairness. The shared trust that lubricated civic life lost viscosity. It no longer flowed smoothly and friction followed. Conflict that had been resolvable with an apology and shared work started to require witnesses, and written. The town's mechanisms, which had long been informal and thus swift and restorative, now demanded formality that widened distance between people. Men who once repaired each other's roofs in a single day of shared labor now insisted on payment and term. Women who had exchanged recipes and remedies, an easy barter, now negotiated access to particular herbs and techniques, as if they were rare commodities. The social economy refracted into a market economy at a pace that loosened the ties of mutual reliance. With this economic reconfiguration came political splits. The council that had once moved like a single organism, its members guided by shared memory and a gentle ethic, fractured into camp. One faction argued for stricter enforcement of written contracts, believing that such enforcement would protect the weak from the cunning. Another argued that returning to the old habit of reconciliation would heal the community faster and with greater justice. The debates were not simple arguments about principle, they were about survival strategies. For some households, formal contracts meant predictability. For others, they meant exposure to loss if they lacked written records, or the means to defend them.
Outside pressures intersected with these internal strains. Traders from afar saw opportunity in the town's disruption. They offered credit and wares to those who could pay for their premium goods, and in doing so, deepened certain households' hold on advantage. Some foreign merchants exploited the newly formalized legal channels to secure special agreements that local smallholders neither understood nor could match. The town found itself entangled in deals that had the sheen of novelty, but the gravity of obligation. A promise of dye delivered this season might become a chain of dependence in the next, when payment was due and grain stocks were thin. Part of the storm's power lay in how quickly it turned neighbor against neighbor. A dispute over water rights, long manageable through a rotation and a modest apology, erupted when one household, flush with tokens, hired help to divert a minor channel for their private garden. The act, practical in itself, carried symbolic weight. It suggested that resources could be privatized under cover of legality. Accusations spread like a wet wind. Families who saw the diversion as an affront demanded redress. Families who defended it argued for the right to improve their holdings. Watchful children went to bed confused at the sudden sharpness of adult voices. Elders found their stories of patient compromise suddenly less persuasive. Violence remained at first sporadic and local, but where violence took root it had a different character. It was less a pitched battle between armies and more a series of targeted clashes. A night raid on a storeroom, the rough shattering of a gate, the sledging of a wyke in the market. These acts, though limited in scale, carried an intense psychological weight. A smashed pot at the market was more than material loss. It was a message that the market itself no longer guaranteed safety and predictability. Fear replaced complacency, and fear rearranged routine. Mothers fetched children earlier. Men who had once lingered in the market at dusk left quickly. Lanterns burned longer into the night, as an effort to ward off the unknown. As nights grew longer with caution, accusations found easier purchase. Rumor is a current. It can carry truth, but it can also carry the shape of what people prefer to believe. The rumor mill, once dedicated to small talk, turned now to whispers of betrayal. A merchant was said to have hoarded grain. A guild leader was accused of taking bribes. A steward was rumored to favor kin. Whether true or not, the rumor hardened into suspicion, and then into policy. The council, weary of being played by appearances, drafted new ordinances that were intended to produce clarity, audits, verified witnesses, stricter penalties. The policies made sense to some, and felt like encroachment to others. The more the council moved to impose clarity, the more some citizens retreated from participation. In the heart of the storm, alliances shifted. Former friends found new alignments based on interest rather than kinship. Marriage ties, which had once been the scaffolding of obligation and mutual aid, were now sometimes used as tactical arrangements in disputes. A marriage might secure an ally in a contested market. A dowry might be leveraged to guarantee favor. This made family life more brittle. Trust between siblings and cousins frayed as each weighed the material benefits of siding with one faction over another. The intimacy that had once softened disagreement was replaced by transactional calculation in too many rooms. The temples, which had long been a place of solace and mediation, felt the pressure. Priests endeavored to be impartial, but even sanctuaries are not immune to the logic of scarcity. Some temples became refuges for those displaced by the storm, their altars offering bread and shelter. Others were pressed into the service of donors whose wealth gave them influence. The sacred and the profane intermingled without a clear boundary, and the faithful came away from certain rites unsure whether they had witnessed devotion or display. The priestly class tried to preserve the language of restraint and repair, but their moral authority had been diminished by the very shifts they sought to correct. Military force, which had been a modest instrument of deterrence, began to be organized more formally. The idea of trained watchmen, once a communal arrangement where neighbors kept hours, turned into a paid cohort with a captain and remit. This was a practical response to the night raids and the breakdown of customary enforcement, yet it raised alarm. Who would appoint the captain? Who would fund the cohort in the lean months? Once a body existed with arms and a written chain of command, it posed a latent threat. A watch that solved immediate problems could, in the wrong hands, become an instrument of partiality. The memories of past restraint made many uneasy. For tools shaped to keep order, can be turned into levers for particular advantage. In the midst of these convulsions, children continued to learn and to play in the margins, but their games became sharper and less trustworthy. They mimicked market stratagems, and the guarded way adults spoke. Where once play mimicked cooperative labor, children pretending to carry a harvest basket together, now they played at bargaining, at hiding and seizing. The innocence of play softened into a replay of the town's anxieties, and the next generation began to internalize patterns of suspicion. Amid the storm, a few actors tried to steer a calmer course. Some elders insisted on public repair ceremonies, calling for a day of shared labor and ritual apology to reset relations. These ceremonies, when followed by sincere acts of repair, shared labor on a canal, a community meal to feed the poor, had an immediate effect of reducing tension. People who had participated in conflict sometimes found that the simple act of repairing together softened grudges, yet these restorative acts required mutual acceptance. When one party refused, healing could not proceed. The storm's noise was not merely external, it brought with it an inner turbulence in many hearts. Those who had earlier adapted to new forms of wealth felt guilt or regret at choices that had eroded public good. The potter who first glazed a cup with extra wood now watched his neighbors struggle. The steward who had ordered certain audits regretted the way people had ceased to speak in open circles. Such private remorse produced small acts of reconciliation, a donated day's labor, a pared-down feast, a decision to teach a skill freely to those who lacked access. These acts were important, for they were seeds of repair, but they often arrived piecemeal and could be swallowed by a larger, continuing cycle of retaliation and mistrust. The storm also revealed a deeper human fact, that systems are fragile where trust is their main support. Institutions, ledgers, guild rules, watch cohorts can make operations clearer and more reliable in certain ways, but they cannot, by themselves, generate the moral glue that keeps a community intact. When the glue frays, institutions tend to harden into mechanisms that seem neutral but can be used by those who control them. The town learned, often painfully, that balancing formal structures with living practices of repair is a delicate art. As the storm reached its apex, decisions arrived that would have long-term consequences. One debated measure was the imposition of a levy to pay the watch cohort. Another was an ordinance to restrict foreign traders from exclusive contracts. A third proposed that the council would require public naming of significant benefactors to avoid backdoor influence. Each option had defenders and critics. None offered immediate, lasting peace. Each required trade-offs that would change the shape of the community. The debates were fierce, not with the clang of arms but with the weary intensity of people who knew that the choice of law would chart the course of daily life for years. At the storm's core there remained a human strain of fear and hope braided together. Fear that the town might slide into persistent conflict, and hope that some careful restorative action might still bring it back. People kept watch in their windows, not only to guard against theft, but to keep an eye on neighbors' moods. If the neighbor returns late with a bowed head, perhaps apology is coming. If a family barters less generously, perhaps they are starving. The storm rearranged the tempo of life in small, intimate ways. Visits were measured, bargains cautious, songs less exultant. Yet even in that rearrangement there were openings for care. In a lane once divided by a disputed fence, an old woman set a pot of stew each afternoon and called for anyone who passed to take a ladle. The small, ordinary generosity drew people in, reminding them of what had been possible before suspicion grew deep. Storms, by their nature, alter landscapes. They fell trees and they shifted riverbeds. They also changed the habits of birds and the attitudes of people. This storm over the city had changed more than property. It had rearranged the question that lingered in the hush after the worst winds, whether they had passed or whether another surge waited beyond the horizon, was larger than any single ordinance or gift. It was a question about how a people could remember the practices that had once bound them, and whether they would find a way to rebuild, brick by deliberate brick, the fragile architecture of mutual life. In that uncertain hour, with lanterns guttering and watchmen on the paths, families returned to hearths, and tried to find the language to begin again. There is a particular hush that follows storms, a softening of sound where even the wind seems to move like someone stepping carefully across a room where things might break. After the tempest that shook the town, the people found themselves standing amid a different light, one that gilded ruins and patience alike. The last light of the empire did not arrive like a sudden eclipse, but as a gradual dimming, as if the moon itself were drawing back its ray. In that gentle recession, everything that remained took on a sharper outline. The tasks that had once been routine now felt heavy with consequence.
and the acts of remembrance multiplied like small candles in a long dark hall. The city in its softer hour tried to hold itself together by what it knew best, habit and ritual. Those habits were now coaxed and strained in equal parts. People rose with the dawn as they always had, but their mornings were threaded with new care. Where once a group might repair a wall as a matter of course, now that repair required negotiation and often payment. Where once a mother could borrow a pot from a neighbor without remark, now the exchange came with ledger entries and awkward thanks. These changes were not only practical but symbolic signs that the invisible fabric of mutual trust had been pulled taut and might not fully spring back. The elders, those who had once kept consensus and example as the main instruments of governance, attempted to renew the small rituals that had mended fractures in the past. They called for days of shared labor, for joint meals at which grievances could be spoken and heard, for the return of certain courtesies that had softened arguments, the giving of a seat, the offering of warm bread, the recitation of a simple story about an ancestor who had given up a harvest to save a neighbor. For a time these practices had power, old habits carried with them authority. A family who had been tipped into a moment of stubbornness, sometimes softened when elders came bearing bread and the public ritual of apology. The act of working together again, lifting stones, dredging a clogged channel, mending a roof, created the small physics of repair, shared effort, shared sweat, and then shared satisfaction, yet at the same time revealed that rituals alone could not reverse the deeper change. The very mechanisms that had once ensured fairness, custom expectation and the public memory kept by simple marks, were now complicated by records and obligations that cut different. A ledger might show in formal terms that a household was indebted, yet the spirit of the community might call for patience. When the two did not match, conflict arose. Creditors, who now depended upon written tokens in order to run their own businesses, pressed for repayment. Debtors, who had expected customary flexibility, pleaded for mercy. The result was the slow attrition of goods. In the end, the city found itself negotiating not only material terms, but the moral grammar by which neighbors treated one another. As the light thinned, the architecture of the town began to tell stories it had never told before. Walls bore the marks of hasty repairs, courtyards displayed evidence of once grand projects left unfinished, fountains that had been added in the brighter years now flowed less steadily, their basins tarnished with moss. The builder's careful lines, which had once seemed permanent, revealed the limits of craft against time and neglect. When a public hall no longer drew the regularity of assemblies because its upkeep required funds that were hard to muster, the absence became visible not merely in a physical way, but in the social landscape. Fewer conversations, fewer shared ceremonies, fewer occasions to renew bonds. Religion too took on a different cast under the dimming light. Priests who had once acted as arbiters of small claims, and as keepers of ritual, now found themselves asked to mediate conflicts that had become legal as well as personal. Their altars carried the scent of burned offerings, but the offerings were less lavish and more improvised. A prayer might be offered for rain and for the return of a missing son. Both needs were practical and spiritual, so that worship in these times became an act of combined hope and accounting. Some temples opened storehouses for the poor, others kept meticulous lists of those who received aid, an uneasy mix of charity and record. In these acts of mercy, the sacred and the civic blurred, and the lines between ritual giving and bureaucratic rationing were not always clear. The culture of learning shifted in ways that shadowed the material decline. Schools that had once been modestly supported by guilds or patrons found their endowments meager. The scribes who taught the young the marks of accounting and the art of careful record-keeping saw fewer apprentices, for families had less capacity to spare a child from labor. Where once knowledge had been taught openly in benches and courtyard corners, instruction grew more privatized and selective. Some masters accepted eager pupils for lower fees, driven by a sense of duty. Others tightened requirements, lest their craft become devalued. The cumulative result was a thinning of distributed competence. Skills that had once been widely held, masonry, water management, certain herbal remedies, became rarer within the general population, concentrated instead in a subset who could afford training. The town's economy contracted in subtle ways. Markets that had once been centered around modest exchange now bore the evidence of contraction. Fewer traders lingering, stalls less bright, simpler wares traded. Where prosperity had widened horizons, contraction narrowed. Traders who once took pleasure in experimenting with new goods now focused on essentials. A potter who had experimented with vibrant glazes returned to making sturdy storage jars. Luxury became a boutique practice, rather than a common feature of life. This economizing was not only a loss of surplus, it was a loss of possibility. the quiet elimination of small joys that had fed the town's cultural heartbeat. One of the most visible losses was the declining maintenance of infrastructure. Canals that had once been dredged with regularity found themselves half-blocked, sluices that ensured fair distribution of water stuck and required more time to operate. In lean times, tasks that required communal effort, repairing terraces, reinforcing levees, were harder to coordinate. Laborers who once asked only for food and shelter now expected token payments. The logic of survival shifted from shared endurance to individual accounting. The practical consequence was grim: fields left unattended, yields diminished, and thus the cycle tightened in a manner that fed back into scarcity. Social differentiation grew more entrenched as the light receded. Families that could protect their stores behind hired custodians, or who negotiated special foreign contracts, maintained better security. Those without such means were more exposed. This inequality manifested not only in wealth but in time and opportunity. The well-to-do could send a child to apprentice abroad, while the poor needed every pair of hands at home. Marriage, which had once been a vehicle for redistributing labor and skills, became a transaction more explicitly shaped by material calculus. Long-standing communal networks of assistance frayed under the pressure of private calculation. With scarcity came the hardening of authority. The watch cohort, now a more permanent body, expanded its remit in ways that stirred tension. Initially commissioned to deter nightly raids and to ensure marketplaces' safety, the watch sometimes became an agent who enforced levies, or who favored those who paid better. Even when the cohort acted with integrity, its presence altered public life. Gatherings felt surveilled, and people chose their words with a new caution. The elders were forced to negotiate with captains and with merchants who had influence over the watch's resources. The shifting balance of power meant that governance increasingly required not only moral authority, but also access to material resources, and this dynamic reshaped the town's politics. A quieter but deep fracture was the erosion of intergenerational confidence. The young observed the older ones' compromises, and took lessons they had not intended: how to bargain, how to hedge a promise, how to keep a private ledger. Their play, as had been seen earlier in the storm, took on the tone of guarded exchange. A child who once learned to share a harvest basket, now learned to count coins, and to secure a small cash for rainy days. This practical education was not malignant. It reflected adaptive intelligence in a changing world. Yet it also meant a cultural shift, a subtle narrowing of the imagination from the communal to the personal. In the midst of decline, there were moments of poignant beauty. A potter might, in a spare hour, shape a bowl with a thin lip so that the act of drinking felt intimate and ceremonial. A weaver might tie a subtle pattern into a cloth that remembered a lost neighbor's name. These acts were acts of resistance, small creations that sustained the human spirit. They did not, however, scale to the needs of the polity. They remained private lights in a dimming city, intimate resistances against a larger loss. The memory keepers attempted to anchor the city's story against the tide. They compiled lists of names, recorded treaties, and preserved songlines that told of past times when the town had negotiated crisis successfully. Their archives became moral telescopes, ways to remind people that such cycles had occurred before, and could be met with patience and strategy. Yet records alone were not enough. Memory had to be animated by practice, by joint labor, by shared meals, by public repair. Without the latter, the former became a kind of elegy. In certain quarters, the conversation shifted toward migration as an answer. Some families, facing reduced yields and strained social ties, considered leaving for regions where trade routes promised steadier returns. Young men went to neighboring towns to seek apprenticeships. Traders pursued longer caravan. Migration offered an exit stratagem, but also drained the town of precisely those who might renew it: the energetic hands, the apprentices, willing to learn and to stay. Those who remained often felt abandoned, and the social fabric further thinned, as kinship networks dispersed. The last light of the empire also revealed moral choices of unusual clarity. Faced with scarcity, some chose to hoard and to tighten the circle of obligation around kin. Others chose to extend the last of their stores to those who needed them, accepting short-term risk for the sake of broader social repair. The choices were not binary virtue tests. They were pragmatic judgments shaded by fear and hope. Over time, the town's fate depended on how many chose to give, rather than to hoard, how many trusted that shared effort might yield a better outcome than private security. The empire's decline had its poetic shape. Much that was beautiful and lasting did not vanish in a single night, but faded into quieter youth. Temples kept their small fires, though attendance dwindled, marketplaces reopened after tense nights, though with fewer smiles, songs still rose at dusk, though they were smaller, and often more sorrowful. The people adapted in ways that preserved a kind of dignity even in loss. They learned, necessary and heartbreaking, to live with less overt abundance while holding on to practices that mattered, tending the youngest, teaching a skill, telling the old stories. In those final years of gentle fading, some among the populace recorded with careful hands the names of who had given, and who had taken, not as accusation, but as testimony. They made lists, that would perhaps centuries later, help a distant reader understand how the city arrived at its end. The details were small: the payment of a watchman's coin, the day a sluice was left unattended, the night a small shrine was repurposed to store grain. Stitch by stitch, they embroidered a narrative that combined human choices, structural change, and the slow arithmetic of resources. And yet, even as the city dimmed, the moon continued her measured circuit. Sometimes, under the late light, a child who had learned to tally coins would pause and look up at the sky and wonder, as children often do, about the shape of things larger than themselves. In that silent wonder, there remained the last light's most important gift, the capacity for reflection. The empire's end was not a single moral verdict, but a complex portrait of human striving, error and care. The final glow did not exculpate or condemn, it simply recorded the fact that people had tried in many ways to hold the world together, and that even in failure, some small acts of tenderness endured. When the final evening of this age settled, those who remained lit a modest number of lamps and gathered in small clusters by the wells and the common oven. They spoke less of blame, and more of stories, of a bridge that had once been built by many hands, of a winter when neighbors shared grain, of a child who learned to sing an old tune. The stories were not an attempt to turn back the clock, but a way to remember what had been possible, and perhaps, a means to teach the future wherever it went, how to stitch a town together again. The last light dimmed, but it did not erase memory. It left behind the soft embers, that if tended, might one day kindle a new quieter rise. When the last lamp gutters, and the town's breath grows very small, the world begins a different kind of keeping. It is not sudden, it arrives like the slow closing of a book, whose pages have been read and set down. Houses that had once been full of talk become vessels of silence, their courtyards empty of the usual clatter, the ovens cool and are covered, tools are set aside and left to a patient. Where once children shouted and ran between market stalls, grasses begin to press through the tamped earthen lanes, and the sound of their feet is replaced by the quieter music of wind across hollow clay. The forgotten ashes are not only the remains of burned objects, they are the leftover shapes of lives whose ordinary warmth has gone out. In that quiet, the true work of forgetting and the gentle accumulation of ruin begin. At first, forgetting is selective and tender. People who must leave take only what they can carry: a pot bound with leather, a favored bowl, a strip of woven cloth folded small. Such things are the small reliquaries of daily life. They travel with those who move away, carrying both utility and memory. Those who remain gather in small clusters to decide which stones can be taken for hearths elsewhere, and which should be left to the weather. A public hall may be emptied with ritual care. The elders may lift the carved lintel and place it in a family's pack as a keepsake, or they may set fire to a bundle of old records in a private ceremony, not to erase, but to transform memory into scent and smoke that will mingle with the air as it goes on. Such acts are intimate and slow, as if the people are reluctant to give up the patterns their hands have learned. As families depart and craftsmen carry their skills to other valleys, workshops fall silent. A potter's wheel, once turned by steady hands, stands still and gently sags. If not tended, its wooden spindle contracts with the seasons and war. A loom, unstrung, sags with the weight of its own waiting, threads slackening into a soft collapse. Over time, vermin and weather join forces with neglect. Clay jars crack from frost, thatch roofs cave where rafters rot. The town that had learned to repair itself with communal effort now finds no hands to do the mending. The culture of maintenance recedes, and with it, the sheen of daily life dulls. Nature is patient about reclamation. Where canals were once carefully dredged, silt settles and reeds take root. The careful channels that guided water into terraced fields are filled with seed and stalk, and then with small shrubs. The river changes course across seasons, and where a sluice once controlled flow, There may now be only a shallow pool thriving with frogs and new water plants. Trees that had been planted in careful rows to cool the streets grow wild and spread branches into places once kept open. Vines creep up carved columns, softening the edges of human making, and moss finds purchase in the shallow grooves of friezes. The built world yields to a patient green. Time compounds neglect into ruin. A well that had served 100 households empties when no fingers draw water from its rim. Its stones, no longer polished by many hands, hold a ring of lichen. A bridge that had bore carts and processions finds a gap where a keystone has fallen. Moss grows into the crevice, and the arch leans like a tired shoulder. Children's names once carved into a bench at the market are smudged by rain and overgrown by small flowers, so that the memory is retained more in the pattern of growth than in the legible line of a letter. The town's map devolves into a softer geography, where the human mind must walk more carefully to remember what had been. Artifacts remain in the slow theater of forgetting. A shard of a pot appears, edges smoothed by seasons, the glaze weathered into a wash of color that hints at the cup's former life. A tile showing the faint impression of a bird lies half buried where a roof once shed rain. A carved stone fragment, the corner of a frieze, with a partially visible wave, rests like a faint note of a song anyone might hum, but no longer recall the full melody. The small scattered things are the grammar of what they do not tell the whole story, but they suggest rhythm and cadence, the way a single plucked string can make one remember an entire tune. When the economy that once animated the town contracts beyond the point of recovery, official records lose their value and become material to be used or burned. Clay strips that recorded transactions, once carefully baked and stored, are repurposed as fill, or smashed and thrown into garden beds, where their fragments become part of the soil. In other cases, they are gathered by a few who still care to keep memory. A scribe may hide a bundle of thin sheets in the hollow of a caravan chest, or an elder may wrap a small list of names into a cloth and tuck it into a crock, as if placing a charm. These acts of preservation are small resistances to the great impartiality of time. Temples, which had been places of careful tending, fall into a peculiar liminal state. Some become shelters for those who cannot leave. They host quiet supplications and the sharing of leftover bread. Others are stripped of ornament and converted to practical use. Their inner rooms may hold grain temporarily, their outbuildings repurposed for storage. In rarer cases, a sacred space is deliberately left empty, the doors closed, and the lintel bracketed with stones as a sign that the people have moved on. The sacred emptiness is different from neglect. It is an intentional cessation, a form of respecting what once held weight by letting it sleep. As years pass, legends begin to grow around the ruins, and forgetfulness and myth blur at the margins. Travelers who pass through the area after a season of drought may tell of a town that once shone like a small star, and their stories take on a slightly different light with each retelling. They say, there was a bridge that sang when the wind passed through its arches, or that a particular fountain once spilled water that smelled like the sea. These tales are not precise history, they are the imaginative filling of gaps, the human habit of making sense of life. Through such stories, the town enters a different kind of life, no longer the pragmatic stage of daily commerce, but a place of memory and mnemonic image.
The surrounding landscape remembers differently. The terraces that once held grains become wildflower meadows in certain seasons, and the songlines of birds shift to include old high walls as nesting spots. Small animals learn to use the structures as shelter. Foxes den in the shadowed eaves, and owls take particular pleasure in the broken lintels as perch and watch. Reptiles warm themselves on abandoned oven stone. The natural world, in reclaiming the human architecture, layers its own life into the marks left behind. The relics become habitats, and the town is repopulated not by the people who once lived there, but by a different chorus, an ecology built out of human absence. For those who migrate away, forgetting is not only loss, but also adaptation. They carry small shards of home in their memories and in their bundles, and those relics help shape new settlements. A potter brings the idea of a particular curve and teaches it to new hands. A weaver remembers the pattern of a season and casts it again into thread for a different climate. In this sense, the town's culture disperses like seeds, and elements of its craft and story reappear elsewhere. The original cluster of houses may fade, but parts of its life ripple across the region through those who carried craft, songs, and recipes to new places. Sometimes, however, forgetting is interrupted by a return. A child who once left as a small thing may come back in later life to sit among the ruins, to count the stones and to remember. Their presence momentarily animates the empty spaces. Their fingers trace the groove where a market table once met the floor. They tell grandchildren the names of streets that have no more names, and point out a remaining tile with the bird impression. These returns are like soft incantations. For a brief season memory thickens, and the ruins become a small theatre of recollection. The visiting family may place a stone on a lintel or sweep a courtyard, and for a day or two, the past returns as practice. Sometimes grief finds ritual in an abandoned place. A group may return to scatter seeds in the terraces, or to plant a sapling in a courtyard where a family once celebrated births. The act is both lament and gift. Lament for what has been lost, gift to the land that will carry new growth. The sapling, if it takes roots among the forgotten, and may one day stand as a marker that says in living terms that this place was once held. In these small acts, memory becomes generative. The ashes that had seemed final take on a slow new life. Archaeology in time will come to these spaces. Long after villagers have moved on, curious minds will wander in with careful tools. The work of uncovering ruins is itself a form of reanimating memory. Potsherds are catalogued, a frieze fragment is lifted and carried with reverence. The silt in a canal is stripped and examined, revealing pollen and small seeds that tell of crops once grown. Bones are studied not as trophies, but as quiet evidence of people who lived and moved. Excavation is an act of patient listening. It seeks clues in the layers of soil and ash, and it can transform a place from a mere remnant into an archive of human life. Yet even as archaeologists reconstruct, they must contend with the fact that the human warmth of daily practice resists being fully captured. Names, jokes, the cadence of a market haggling, these human details slip through the sieve of stratigraphy. Ruins, when preserved in museum glass or catalogued in an academic paper, take on a different kind of life, one that is curated and framed. Artifacts are labeled with dates and probable uses, their histories drafted into narratives useful for teaching and scholarship. This reframing is not a second death, but a translation. The things are translated into objects of knowledge. They move from being parts of daily life to tokens of understanding. Their value changes. Where once a pot served stew, now it helps explain technique and trade. The interpretation is generous but selective, and it creates a layer of meaning that will speak to future minds. And yet even as scholars work, the landscape continues its indifferent reclamation. Stones moved into museum shelves are still only a part of the whole. The walls that remain stand witness to the loss of an integrated life. Houses, ovens, workshops, wells, each component part missing its companions. The town's story becomes fragmented into objects and sketches, and the patient work of piecing together how a people planned and lived. Such reconstruction is generous work, but it cannot fully return the warmth of the hearth or the gossip by the well. The forgotten ashes, then, are neither wholly ruin nor wholly silent. They are a place of transformation, where human making yields back to the patient processes of time and where memory relocates itself into objects, stories, and landscape. In that territory, some things are preserved, carved stones, recorded lists, pot fragments, while others are absorbed into new growth. The town's life continues in fractured ways, in the patterns of a weave taught in another valley, in a recipe passed down with a potter's son, in a proverb that names a particular canal. The ash is not the end of meaning, it is a palimpsest, where new inscriptions will be written on top of old ones. So the town settles into the long arc of forgetting, and occasional remembering. Wind moves through colonnades, and through the dried reeds that have taken the place of market stalls. Dawn still comes, color finding the high carved edges, and making them burn faintly. And night still brings stars that have no need for markets or councils. Birds sing where once songs had different subjects, and the river sings on. In moments when the sun falls just right, a shard of glaze will flash and suggest a cup raised in a grateful hand. In those tiny glints, the memory of what was lives briefly, like the reflection of light on a sleeping face. The ashes are forgotten, but they also keep a trace, an ember that can, if tended by those who remember, warm a new beginning. When the last voices fade and the lamps go cold, time takes its own careful hand and covers the city with a silence that is not empty but full of small postponement. Centuries do not leap, they accumulate in patient measures, each year pressing down a fine layer of quiet, until the place that once hummed with human purpose becomes a slow repository of pauses. The silence of centuries is not a blank, it is a living hush that gathers sound into a new shape. Wind becomes the town's storyteller, rain reads the lines of the walls, the moon, patient and indifferent, keeps its slow vigil. Under such long quiet, the past ceases to be a series of events and becomes more like a single slow breath that lengthens and deepens until memory itself changes voice. Paths that once held daily footsteps are reclaimed by grasses and small shrubs, whose roots pry gently at the packed earth and force an old geometry to soften. Where markets had boomed with the transaction and the joke, now mushrooms expand in clustered rings where spilled grain once lay. The wells where people drew water and gossip sometimes pool only after a heavy season. Their rims are sutured with lichen, and moss catches dew like beads on a necklace. The surfaces that people polished by touch become canvases for rain and sun. Carved bands fade into soft grooves, rhymed with time. In the slow accretion of years, the city's edges blur. What was a wall becomes a garden. What was a street becomes a dry bed with the faint trace of an old wheel mark like a relic left on a sleeping body. Silence alters the scale of things. Great halls, once resonant with counsel and song, now house only the flutter of birds, or the hush of a fox slipping through an arch. Columns that held up roofs and hopes stand like dormant trees, their ornaments softened by weather into the half-remembered shapes of hands and waves. Roofs collapse and leave terraces open to sky. Courtyards that once hosted lantern-lit narratives become places where stars can rest more fully on the stone. The architecture becomes a skeleton that memory and moss jointly inhabit. In that state, each object, an amphora half buried, a threshold stone worn by many feet, gains a weightier silence, an insistence that it was once used and loved. Seasons, in their endless turning, become the true chroniclers. Winter frost outlines letters no scribe now reads. Spring floods wash new sediment over old foundations. Summer sun bleaches the last traces of painted bands. Years become a palimpsest of weather rather than of record. Pollen carried by wind and insect settles into the crevices and tells a patient story of what grew there in each age. Wild barley replacing cultivated grain, a succession of trees that favored the shade of absent roofs, a slow migration of plant species in response to the altered microclimate. The land writes its own marginalia on human craft, and the botanist of centuries hence, reading those notes, will know more about a diet than many an inscription can convey. Animals, too, settle into the silent city with the modest confidence of those who build with less intention. Birds, opportunistic and precise, claim niches in friezes and keep watch from lintels. Small mammals make dens behind fallen walls. An old oven, its mouth dark, becomes a nest for a brood of swifts, and the faint heat that once dried dough is replaced by the warm bodies of new tenants. The city's human absence is not a vacancy, but a redistribution. Other lives measure space and time according to rhythms different from those of sowing and market. In the push and pull of these new occupants, the ruins gain new kinds of life. Their presence does not restore what was lost, but it gives a quiet continuity that softens the edges of absence. In quiet places, language shifts. The old names, lane names and family tags, the carved inscriptions that once indicated function wear away. Children born generations after the last household left will learn, if they learn at all, new names for the places. A street called once for a potter may now be the Sparrow Way. A market well may be called the Frog Pool. Such renaming is not mere array. It is evidence of life recasting itself, of the human habit of reattaching meaning to place in terms of present use. Yet in that process, original names sometimes survive as echoes tucked into folk tales or as a single syllable carried by an elder who remembers and speaks the sound like a child. Memory itself practices strange economies in the hush of centuries. Some things are recalled in fine detail, the recipe of a famous stew, the measured curve of a beloved cup,
while the architecture of governance or the cadence of a certain ritual falls into generality. There is a human tendency to keep the small, tactile things: a well-made pot's rim, the pattern that a weaving taught a child, the taste of a dish on a certain winter day. These small memories travel with people who leave. They are seeds, sent forth to sprout in other communities. In contrast, large social practices that require many hands, coordinated canal maintenance, consensus councils, are harder to transplant intact and tend to dissipate unless their practices are deliberately taught and institutionalized elsewhere. Thus, the silence of centuries selects for certain memories and allows others to thin into legend. Legends grow in that thinning. Where the practical memory fails, imagination draws line. A fragmentary arch, for instance, can become a telling point in a myth about a city that once bridged two worlds. Stories gather around the ruins like lichen around stone. Travelers who pass through in later ages tell tales of hidden treasures, of fountains that sing at midnight, of ghosts who pace the broken colonnades. Those who listen may embellish the tales, adding color and moral to make them into parables about greed and generosity, about the rise of small virtues or the cost of vanity. Legends are moral scaffolding for those who seek lessons in ruins, and by their telling they keep the past alive in a new register. Silence allows time for new craftsmen of memory to arise: the chroniclers who listen to birds and stones, the poets who compose songs around a shard, the elders who teach children a single line about a once grand bridge. In many cultures, the task of conserving memory becomes an honored labor of skins and words. Across centuries, stories are carried in the same way seeds are carried, sometimes by bloodline, sometimes by trade, sometimes by chance. A grandmother may tell a child of a river that used to be deeper and note the name of a maker whose pottery everyone once loved. The child grows up, perhaps moves to a different valley, and the name survives in that new place as a faint filament connecting distant communities. Silence also changes the relationship between human remains and the landscape. Graves, once tended, sink into the soil or are covered by new mounds. Stone markers, if not toppled, are smoothed by lichen and rain, their inscriptions losing clarity. In quiet, the dead are folded into the land in a gentler way, bones compost into soil, and the nutrients become part of future growth. This biological return is a natural cycle that complicates the human desire for permanence. Leaves and roots will over time make a body indistinguishable from the earth it once tilled. The silence of centuries is thus both a cover and a cradle. What is forgotten is not simply lost, but transformed into other forms of life. Sometimes human hands attempt interruptions to the slow hush. A passerby might collect a shard and tuck it into a pocket. A traveler might leave a mark on a column with a nail to signal passage. A child returning to visit ancestors might sweep a courtyard and leave flowers. These ephemeral acts of recollection are gestures against amnesia. They do not reverse the long processes irrevocably, but they make small islands of remembering. In this way, the silence is punctuated by private and fragile refractions of the past, acts that keep memory as relational and living rather than merely archival. Over long spans, the region's climate may shift, and with it the contours of the ruin's significance. Rivers may change course. Tributaries that once fed terraces will fatten or shrink according to broader climatic moods. Droughts or wetter centuries expand or contract the area that supports agriculture. These shifts alter what ruins mean to later generations. A once practical canal might become a scenic wetland, and where grain was once raised, there might now be reeds for basket makers. The silence is thus not a single condition but a changing relation between human construction and natural processes. New ecologies form atop the architecture of old lives, creating landscapes that future peoples recognize as both ancient and alive. In some epochs, entire civilizations look back with fascination. Scholars and curious travelers in distant ages sometimes approach the silent city with methodical care and a certain reverence. They measure, draw, and catalog. They lift fragments and piece together hypotheses about how people lived, what they ate, how they negotiated water. That process, archaeology in the later sense, is a conversation across time. The silent stones speak in clues, and the curious ask questions. This work is slow and humble, and it reveals both much and little. Much about technology and diet, little about jokes, and the private tones of affection that warmed evenings. Archaeology restores parts of life, but cannot fully reconstruct the living pulse that once animated every hearth. Religious and philosophical reflections take different forms in the hush as well. Where a temple once held an active congregation, Centuries of silence may transform the site into a place of contemplative pilgrimage, or into a site of simple curiosity. For some, the ruins become an object lesson in humility, a reminder that all human effort is fragile under the stretch of time. For others, they are proof that human art persists in ways that outlast ordinary use. The same stones are read differently as cautionary tales, as monuments to craft, as places where one might lay down a small offering and speak of continuity. The silence encourages multiple readings, and through this multiplicity the ruins remain meaningful even when their original context is gone. Language alters how later ages interpret the silent city. If a people maintain a written tradition, they may produce chronicles that mention the place and set it into a larger narrative of migration and loss. If they do not, the memory may survive in song or in woven motifs that replicate a pattern once common in the ruined town. Such cultural echoes can be diffused and subtle, a stitch in a tapestry, a refrain in a lullaby, a proverb that names a particular canal as an example. These scattered traces are the strands by which continuity is held. They are fragile but persist. The silence of centuries is porous to these strands. It receives and permits transmission. There are moments when the silent city returns to human attention not out of curiosity, but necessity. A later people, needing stone, may quarry parts of the ruin for building material. Foundations go into new houses. Friezes are carried off and repurposed as thresholds in other settlements. This practical recycling is often done without thought for antiquity, but out of immediate need, a telling fact about the continuity of human life. Ruins are resources for later communities, just as they were once resources for the original inhabitants. The silence thus contains opportunities for continuity and transformation through reuse. And still, through the hush of centuries, certain small things persist like stars that do not waver. A name whispered by an old woman, a recipe for a bread that carries a scent of a particular clay oven, a pattern in a child's wrap that echoes a long-ago weave. These particulars survive in human bodies and hands, and in the acts of teaching. They are the ember sparks of a culture that refused total extinction. The silence is not absolute. It is a condition in which such sparks are rarer, and must be tended carefully if they are to become flames again. In the long hush, time learns to be patient and people learn to be smaller in their ambitions. The city sleeps in a folded way, its stories held in residue and rumor, in plant and bone, and in the occasional returning footstep. The silence of centuries is not the end of story, but a different mode of being, a slow archive, a brim of natural life, a repository of fragments that may be read and reassembled, imperfectly but lovingly by those who care to listen. It invites a kind of humility, an acceptance that most human arrangements will pass, and yet it also insists that the traces left behind matter. In those traces, a future may find a blueprint for starting small again, for learning the rhythms that once kept canals running and hearts steady. The silence is long, but it is not empty. It is patient, and in its patience it keeps open the possibility that memory, when called upon, will speak again. For long ages, the place lay quiet, a folded map of memory where only the wind knew the exact folds. Then one season, when the rains were uncertain and the roadways began to feel smaller to people in other valleys, a curious foot arrived, not of those who fled or those who repurposed stone for need, but of someone whose work was the patient opening of things that had been closed. The rediscovery did not begin with a trumpet or a sudden proclamation. It began with a passerby pausing at the edge of a field, noticing a shard of glaze caught in the grass, and out of habit or tenderness, stooping to pick it up. That small action, that bending to gather what the world had left, set in motion a slow attention that would move like a gentle dawn across a sleeping map. The first visitors were travelers and shepherds who liked to stop where old shade remained in the heat of the day. They noticed details that strangers often notice more readily than those who have become used to absence. A column half buried, that rose like a tooth from the earth. A low arch whose silhouette suggested a door once formal and important. They spoke quietly at first. A shard, a carved stone, a rhythmic remnant of pattern. These were small clues that a human hand had once worked here with care. Their voices carried the tone of wonder, not triumph. They told neighbors who were themselves curious, and the curiosity spread not loudly but like a rumor. The place is there, folded into the meadow, and it holds something that looks like care. Scholars and careful hands followed the rumor. They arrived with tools and patience, not with the intention to plunder, but with the intention to listen. Rediscovery is like listening at a closed door. The first act is the gentle knock, careful clearing of vines, the brushing aside of soil, the lifting of a single tile. Those who came were mindful of not disturbing more than necessary. They had learned a humility to be tender with what remained, for ruins are fragile and human residues are delicate. An excavator will often begin with a question, and with small steps, and in this case the initial step was the careful mapping of visible fragments. Someone measured the distance between two stones, and noted a curve in a lintel. Someone else sketched the echo of a frieze in the moss. The work unfolded in the rhythm of small discoveries and patient cataloguing. The first discoveries were modest but rich in suggestion. Potsherds showing the faint remains of a blue glaze hinted at the potter's kiln and the taste for deep color. A length of carved molding suggested an architectural vocabulary of repeated waves and palms. A shallow depression filled with rounded pebbles seemed to be the bottom of a small fountain, and when rain gathered there, it sang more clearly to those who had ears tuned for material memory. A single clay strip found in the reed-lined channel bore marks that a reader later identified as a form of counting, an account of grain perhaps, or a record of labor. These small things were not yet a city, but they were a sequence of clues that a human community had once planned and possessed. As the work grew more deliberate, the landscape itself yielded more. Trenches showed the lines of old foundations. A carefully cleared courtyard revealed the ghost of a hearth, its stones laid in patterns that suggested special use. Where terraces once ran, layers of silt and pollen told a botanical story. A palynologist, with the exactness of someone who reads flowers' history, could tell what crops had been grown by counting spores in the soil. The material record and nature's evidence began to speak in the same tone. People had tended this place, had built for certain seasons, had chosen certain plants, and not others. Each new datum fitted into an emerging narrative that stitched craft to diet, architecture to irrigation, the human to the seasonal. Rediscovery brought a quiet social drama as well. The region's people watched outsiders move carefully through the ruins. Some felt pride that the stones of their grandparents were being treated with attention. Others feared that the attention might bring unwanted interest, that knowledge might stir avarice. Conversations occurred in market corners and at wells. Should the place be protected and preserved, or open to the world so that craft and trade might be revived? These debates were not clumsy. They were careful, shaped by the lived memory of what had been lost, and by a cautious hope about what might be gained. In many cases, the old families sent members to assist the careful diggers, offering small hospitality and sharing oral fragments, tales and names that had been preserved like seeds in pockets. Archaeologists work like listeners of the earth. They uncover in sequences, respectful of layers, knowing that each stratum is a kind of diary. They take time to ask small questions. Which side of the road did people prefer for markets? How deep was the well? Which jars were used for oils and which for grain? Their methods are not showy, they are contemplative. Brushes replace heavy tools. Sieves catch the smallest fragments that might otherwise be lost. In this rediscovery, the approach was the old art of conversation. Ask, wait, reveal a little, then listen. The rewards were not immediate fanfare but steady comprehension. As more was brought into light, the town stitched itself into a readable pattern. Perhaps the most moving moments were the small domestic details that connected strangers with the intimate pulse of daily life. A child's play object, an amber bead, cracked by time, suggested a morning's game. A ragged piece of woven cloth, with a pattern repeated in a way that suggested a nursery rhyme, made visitors imagine soft hands and the ritual of wrapping a child for sleep. A threshold with repeated scuff marks told not of kings and markets, but of the countless small returns, the coming home after a day's labor, the small talk at a doorway. These fragments made the past human and touchable. They reminded rediscoverers not only of the town's structural life, but of the people who had lived in it across seasons, laughed and argued, loved and tended. Rediscovery also reshaped the landscape's social life. Once nearby people realized the place's significance, they began to form new relationships with it. Some families volunteered to guard certain areas to prevent casual damage. Others collected stories and songs to ensure that the intangible heritage did not slip away. Small museum spaces were improvised in nearby clusters of houses, open rooms, where a stranger could see a potsherd or a carved piece, and feel a connection to the place. These modest displays were not flashy, they were humble bookends to memory, and they served to anchor the past in the present. Over time, the rediscovered town became both an object of study and a focal point for local identity. The rediscovery process also crossed disciplines. A mason examined how stones had been joined. A botanist read the plant residues. A linguist studied the marks on clay. Each discipline added a strand to the emerging story. The potter's shards suggested trade routes, how certain clays or glazes reached the town. The traces of fish scales in refuse pits indicated seasonal diets and river use. The variety of seeds showed which plants were cultivated and which were gathered. These threads woven together formed a tapestry that allowed the rediscoverers to imagine the town not as an isolated ruin, but as a node in a network of exchange, labor, and culture. There was also an ethical conversation that grew with discovery. How should the site be treated? Who had the right to decide what was kept and what was left in situ? These questions were not academic abstractions, but practical concerns with real consequences. Some advocated for removal of artifacts to distant institutions, for preservation and study. Others argued that things should remain on their original ground, for context and for local stewardship. The compromise often involved cataloging and carefully documenting in situ items, and creating shared custodial arrangements that respected local families' ties to the land. In the careful negotiations, rediscovery itself became a practice of listening to many voices, scientific, local, ethical, and finding a manner of care that honored the site's multiple meanings. The rediscovered town also changed the rhythms of the region. Pilgrims of a different sort, students, craftspeople, curious travelers, came to learn and to practice. Small workshops reopened near the dig, where potters attempted to reconstruct ancient glazes by gentle experiment, and weavers tried to reproduce the old patterns with the help of fragments found in a sunken chest. These attempts were never mere copying. They were acts of dialogue across time, translating the past's aesthetic and technology into living practice. Young apprentices learned to tie knots that had been in use for generations. Elders taught the subtleties of lime mortar in measured evening. The old techniques were stitched to new hands, and in that stitching a living tradition began to re-emerge in a modest, careful way. Rediscovery changed language and story. Where once the town's name had been quiet, scholars now spoke it aloud in measured tones, giving context and tentative date. Newspapers in nearby settlements wrote careful, respectful pieces about the quiet findings, and in the evenings people read aloud the catalogued notes in communal rooms. Songs were adapted. A refrain from an old nursery pattern might become a chorus in a new ballad about the town's resilience. The rediscovery thus reanimated cultural forms, offering old images new air. Yet rediscovery is never a neat rebirth. It is more like a slow rescue operation that also recognizes the right of the land and the layers upon it. The rediscoverers often had to resist the temptation to make too loud an impression. Tourists might want to carry away a painted tile. Treasure seekers might prowl at dusk. Curious youth might excavate shallow pits out of a misguided desire to find treasure. Protection measures, therefore, had to be practical and gentle. Local guardians, modest signage, and community workshops teaching how to handle artifacts properly. The balance between opening the past to learning and preserving it from harm became one of the site's central governance challenges.
In time, the rediscovery reached broader conversations about continuity and loss. Scholars published careful essays about what the fragments indicated, about trade, irrigation, craft, and social customs, while poets and storytellers wove the facts into narratives that honored the human texture. Museums displayed items with contextual panels that spoke of the daily life that the artifacts once belonged to. Students from nearby towns visited the site as part of learning, and elder members of the wider community came to tell stories that filled the academic description with warmth. The rediscovery had a pedagogy. It taught people not to project grand designs onto the past, but to appreciate the slow work of ordinary life. Perhaps the most moving effect of rediscovery was the chance it gave to families who had left long ago. Those who had carried a pot or a fragment as heirlooms now saw their objects in the place that had made them. They walked again among the stones and pointed out where a house might have stood, where a courtyard had been, the faint bowl of a well. It was not a full return. Too much had been lost to make complete restoration possible. Yet these visits mattered deeply. They were acts of recognition and of mourning and of gratitude. People told stories, and those stories, recorded by patient ears, became part of the public account. Rediscovery thus did not only tell the world about a site, it allowed descendants to re-engage with their past in a manner that honored both absence and continuity. In the rediscovery's gentle months and years, the moonlight that had watched over the town for centuries seemed to give an approving glow. The light made glazes gleam, revealed the soft line of a carved frieze, and taught late-night workers to proceed with quiet hand. The ruins, once resigned to silence, now listened to new voices. Questions, small arguments about meaning, songs practiced by apprentices. The town had become in a new sense a living classroom where the past taught patience and modesty, and where the present learned to be careful with wonder. Rediscovery is, finally, an act of translation. It takes the mute artifacts and turns them into sentences that speak of human days. It translates the soft marks of a threshold into the act of coming home. It turns the worn lip of a pot into a story about a particular meal. In those translations, both the past and the present are changed. The past becomes legible in small ways, and the present gains a sense of depth that grounds ambition in the modest patience of previous makers. For the rediscovery was not a way to conjure back what was lost, but a way to learn from what remained, the forms of living that had once held a people together, the tender technologies of survival, and the cultural habits that might be carried gently into a future shaped by remembrance and care. If history has a breath, it often comes out of ruins as a soft exhale that smells of earth and dried grain. When the town lay silent, and later when curious hands began to clear stones and read strata, a set of small lessons emerged from the dust, quiet teachings that did not insist but invited attention. These lessons are not proclamations. They are careful observations offered by things that remain. They are simple and patient. They ask us not to leap to judgment, but to learn the modest arts of attention, repair, and humility. In the slow light that follows rediscovery, people found that the dust itself had stories to tell, and the stories became teachers. The first lesson the dust offered was about time, about the way small choices compound into shape. A shard of pottery, the thickness of its rim, the traces of a particular glaze, all tell a story about resources and priority. When many shards show thin rims and fine glazes, a subtle cultural value is revealed. A people who cared for the finishing of objects, who had the leisure and the wood to run kilns long enough for a deep color. When foundations show repeated repairs in certain joints, the lesson is practical, maintenance was regular, and the society had the habit of upkeep. Time is not only a measure of longevity, it is an arithmetic of repeated acts. The dust reminds us that years of neglect were preceded by years of making and tending, and that decline is often the cumulative effect of many small omissions rather than a single dramatic failure. A second lesson concerns the care of common good. The mud-lined cisterns, the channels once kept clear, the leveled terraces, all of these point to an ethic of shared responsibility. Where maintenance was routine, crops rose reliably. Where it was not, yields faltered and the social fabric thinned. This teaching is practical and moral at once. Public works are not merely infrastructure, they are manifest ethics. To care for a canal is to care for the neighbor whose field relies on the same water. The dust in its slow accumulation shows the cost of neglect and the value of shared labor in clear, non-judgmental terms. Another lesson is about the economy of small things. The shards of bowls and the leftover threads tell us about a culture that measured well-being in modest objects: cups for daily tea, mats woven for beds, knives kept sharp. These items were cultivated with care. Their presence in abundance shows what mattered, not only grand monuments, but the things that ease daily life. The lesson here is practical. Resilience is not only a matter of grand strategy, but of countless small conveniences done well. A society that can make and repair its everyday objects at scale possesses a sturdy kind of wealth that is not easily taken by storm or drought. The dust also instructs in the art of generosity proportioned to capacity. The records and testimonies accumulated in the rediscovery show households that gave what they could. They were not distant benefactors who sought recognition. They were neighbors who endowed a small kiln or who contributed a day's labor during a bad season. The lesson is ethical. Generosity scaled to means tends to preserve dignity. When giving becomes a theater of display, social bonds change. The lesson of dust is therefore a warning and a guide. Generosity that recognizes mutual dependence and lack of spectacle tends to maintain cohesion. Another quiet teaching concerns the circulation of knowledge. The archaeological strata show patterns of apprenticeship and skill transfer, marks where a master mason's measure repeats across a set of walls, where the same dye recipe appears in many shards. The presence of that repetition points to an institutional habit of teaching craft openly. The lesson is clear: skills preserved in distributed hands make a society resilient. When knowledge concentrates and becomes private, vulnerability grows. Dust does not speak in moralizing terms, but its pattern is a pragmatic admonition: teach widely and keep craft in common.
Dust teaches a gentle economy of desire. The fragments of ornament, small beads, modest rings, and carefully glazed cups, suggest a culture that cultivated taste without overwhelming need. The lesson is that refinement and restraint can coexist. Beauty need not be expensive on the scale of communal resources to enrich life. The artifacts show that when beauty aligns with utility, it is less likely to strain public good. Desire need not be eradicated. It needs to be channeled into forms that sustain rather than consume the common pool. A further lesson is about law and its spirit. The clay strips that recorded transactions and the marks that mediated disputes reveal that an explicit practice of reconciliation was often preferred to mere punishment. The dust preserves both the official marks and the traces of ritual repair. The instruction here is subtle. Law must be embedded in a moral ecology of repair. Rules without practices of restoration harden into instruments of exclusion. Law coupled with repair restores the social fabric. The sediment that hides these fragments reminds us that governance is more than decree, it is cultivation. Dust also carries lessons about foreign exchange, about the ways a town sits in a network of roots and ideas. Glazed fragments from far valleys, pigments that require a distant mineral, a technique that arrives from a neighboring people, all these artifacts show how connectedness can enrich. The lesson is dual. Connectivity brings innovation and resources, but it also brings risks, dependency, entanglement and altered priorities. The dust teaches prudence. Engage with wider worlds, but do so wisely, with safeguards that protect the local common. There is a lesson about memory and narrative. The way stories survive, what is remembered, what becomes legend, teaches the value of oral transmission and the fragility of institutional memory. The palimpsest of a place shows how tangible records can be lost and how songs, proverbs and patterns often persist longer in living practice. The lesson is that communities should find ways to encode practical knowledge in both durable records and in everyday habits. Memory must be embodied in routine tasks, taught to children, and written when possible. The dust encourages redundancy. Do not store all knowledge in one form. Spread it across bodies, rituals and marks. From the dust comes a lesson on humility before the forces of nature. The failed terraces, the sluices left unrepaired, the remnants of a bridge that sagged under floodwaters, remind us that human craft is always contingent. The lesson is not fatalistic, it is modest. Build resiliently, anticipate variability and keep repair as a social habit. The dust fragments are a practical curriculum in the limits of human foresight and the importance of systems that assume change. There is also a lesson about grief and ritual. The abandoned shrines and repurposed altars show how communities cope when they cannot keep up with the obligations of the sacred and the civic. They teach that ritual is malleable. People convert forms of devotion into acts of care, opening a temple as a shelter, offering a shrine as a granary. The lesson is humane. Ritual can be repurposed in the service of survival without losing its ethical core. The dust carries the residue of those acts not as desecration but as adaptive devotion. Dust offers a lesson on leadership. The broken crown, so evident in the ruins, shows how the concentration of authority without accountability leads to fissures. It suggests that leadership grounded in service and humility produces durability. Leaders in the archaeological record were respected, not for pomp, but for their capacity to coordinate labor, to mediate disputes and to act as stewards of common goods. Their absence or corruption left marks in the strata, inequitable distributions, neglected works and hastily patched walls. The lesson is managerial and moral. Leadership must be practiced as stewardship. There is also an aesthetic lesson. The fragment's grace, the deliberate curve of a jar's rim, the balanced knot of a weave, teaches how restraint and proportion can create beauty that endures. The desertion of grand excess and the endurance of moderate, well-made things suggest aesthetic priorities that favor longevity over spectacle. The dust whispers that art need not shout. It can quiet life in ways that make everyday existence more bearable and more lovely. From urn fragment to lintel, the dust instructs in the politics of gifts. It shows how benefaction that binds the donor to the community and specifies service rather than permanent display sustains civic life. Gifts that required maintenance contracts or that obligated the giver to ongoing service, sponsoring a kiln and tending it, kept wealth from becoming a mere symbol and made it kinetic in service. The lesson is practical. Design gifts so that they foster ongoing engagement rather than passive commemoration. A further lesson pertains to the ethics of preservation. The rediscovery opened a moral conversation: what to preserve, how to interpret, who decide. The dust reminds us that stewardship is a shared responsibility and that preservation is not merely an act of freezing, but an act of contextual care. Objects taken from their setting lose a part of their meaning. Their use as teaching tools must be balanced with reverence for local connection. The lesson is diplomatic. Include local voices. Practice humility and do no harm in the name of knowledge. There is a lesson in continuity through dispersion. The descendants who carried shards and techniques across valleys were recipients and vectors of culture. The dust shows that while a town can be left, its practices can travel, and in traveling they can adapt and survive. The lesson is optimistic. Cultural elements recede elsewhere, cross-pollinate, and can reappear in new forms. The dust does not mourn only loss, it catalogues transformation. A humane lesson concerns compassion in policy. The tablets and marks show periods where leaders practiced care, where food was distributed and labor coordinated to meet a drought. The success of such policies was visible in layers where fields continued to yield despite lean season. The lesson institutional compassion matters. Policies that institutionalize mutual aid, rather than leaving help to individual charity, produce resilience. The dust holds the evidence that organizing kindness is both ethical and practical. Lastly, perhaps most important, the dust teaches about humility before complexity. Human societies are not simple machines whose parts can be swapped without consequence. Each element, ritual, craft, leadership, law, exchange, interacts with others. The collapse was not simply a moral failing or a natural disaster, it was an entanglement of choices, policies, and environmental shifts. The lesson is methodological. When diagnosing past failure, resist single-factor narratives. Pay attention to the way. From these small lectures, readers of the dust learn a pedagogy, observe patterns, measure consequences, prioritize repair, distribute knowledge, and design institutions that embed humility and mutual aid. Dust is not condemning, it is instructive. It asks us to consider what we would do differently were we the stewards of a living place. It asks us how we would bind our comforts to communal care, how we would teach the young not only skill but also temperance, and how we would make leadership a matter of service rather than patrimony. Perhaps the most tender lesson is that of small mercies. The shards and lintels do not always reveal grand acts of heroism, they often reveal small kindnesses, an extra basket given in a lean year, a potter teaching a child, a priest sharing a meal. These acts repeated, form the real currency of durable life. The dust shows that heroism in ordinary societies is quiet and cumulative. It does not always make for dramatic stories, but it is the fabric upon which dramatic events are sewn. In learning from dust, there is also a call to practice. The lessons are only as good as the habits they inspire. They are not mere wisdom to be admired in essay form, they are prompts for action. They ask communities and leaders to set up institutions that make repair routine, to teach craft openly, to design gifts that require stewardship, to embed compassion into policy, to balance connectivity with safeguards, and to remember that desire must be channeled by shared norms. Dust is thus both mirror and manual, a mirror to show what happened and a manual pointing to how to keep it from repeating without thought. The dust concludes, softly, with a reminder of grace. It tells of the potter who kept a small bowl for the neighbor's sick child, of the elder who taught a song to those who would not be able to understand the ledger, of the woman who swept the ruined steps and left a cot for a passing traveler. These small mercies, preserved in oral memory and sometimes in the worn polish of a bowl's rim, are the things that make the lessons humane. They are the practical ethics that dust recommends, small, repeated, ordinary acts of care. And finally, the dust insists on patience. The lessons it offers are not instant cures, they are rhythms that require cultivation, repetition, and the willingness to set aside immediate gain for durable common life. The dust speaks in the voice of slow labor, in the cadence of repair, and in the steady practice of mutual aid. If one listens, the lessons are generous and practical. They do not moralize so much as invite a disciplined love of things well tended, and people well served. The rediscovery gave these lessons a hearing. As people read the dust, academics, artisans, elders, and apprentices alike, they translated its quiet teachings into new habits, community workshops to teach old crafts, councils that codified practices of repair, modest endowments tied to stewardship, and rituals that honored mutual aid. In the gentle afterglow, the lessons of dust turned from admonition into practice. They formed a small curriculum for living, born of loss and shaped by attention. So the town's dust, patient and unassuming, keeps instructing those who will listen. It reminds us that history is not merely the sum of triumphs and failures, but a teacher that offers precise, actionable knowledge if we attend. In attending, we learn to protect what sustains life, and to be modest about what we prize. The dust teaches care, it teaches repair, it teaches humility, and quietly it teaches that even where empires dim, the small mercies of daily life can be preserved and taught again, like seeds, into the future. In the quiet that follows study and repair, there is a moment when thought lifts from the particulars of stone and mortar, and rises to the larger question of what it is to build at all. The dream of humanity is not a single grand vision, it is a layered imagination that gathers in small acts, the careful shaping of a potter's rim, the deliberate joining of stone, the ritual sharing of bread. From the dust and the ruins, from the hands that learned and taught, a larger pattern becomes visible, people striving to make life steadier, kinder, and a little more beautiful. The dream does not demand empire or monument, it asks for habit, practice, and the courage to keep the next day in mind when choosing what to do today. We can learn to read this dream as a kind of practical hope. It is not utopian fervor, but a persistent orientation toward repair, and toward the weaving of social ties. In the towns and valleys where crafts were learned and passed, the dream took daily form, apprentices arriving at dawn to sit at a master's bench, elders convening to decide the fair turn for a sluice, neighbors trading bread for pottery in a way that balanced need and skill. The dream's infrastructure was modest, public granaries that could be opened in harsh seasons, a practice of acknowledging debts by public acts of repair, norms that encouraged sharing without dissolving incentive. These small institutions repeated over generations were the building blocks of a dream that at its heart trusted in people's capacity to care for one another and to make durable things. From the ashes and the dust one sees how fragile such an orientation can be, and how easily it is bent by new pressures. Yet the dream persists because it is grounded in simple human satisfactions, the shared meal, the relief of a well-tended canal, the quiet pleasure of a well-made cup. These pleasures are not trivial, they are the soil in which larger civic virtues grow. A culture that values the modest grace of daily life tends to cultivate patience, humility, and a willingness to in those virtues there is a politics not of domination, but of stewardship that shapes institutions toward care, and away from spectacle. Consider the artistry of tools and homes. Once the people chose proportion and functionality, they created a daily environment that taught measures of good behavior. Doors that opened smoothly taught courtesy of passage, lanes that invited conversation taught sociability, ovens designed to be tended by many hands taught the ethic of sharing. The dream, then, is pedagogical. It designs environments that shape the hearts and habits of those who live inside them. The lesson is old and practical. Form teaches function and character, teaches governance. If architecture and craft set a standard for how people move and relate, then the very act of making well is a public pedagogy. There is also a moral imagination in the dream of humanity that insists on bounded desire. The people who made the most enduring crafts did so with a humility that prized durability over display. They understood that the good life was not an endless expansion of appetite, but a moderated flourishing of capabilities, the ability to feed neighbors, to teach a child, to mend a. This ethic of sufficiency resists both the sting of envy and the barren glamour of excess. It proposes instead an aesthetic of restraint, where beauty is woven into usefulness. The dream of humanity in this view is not antagonistic to pleasure, it refashions pleasure toward communal end. The dream also recognizes the centrality of repair. To repair is to acknowledge that things break, and that we must be willing to invest time and care to restore them. Repair is a moral discipline. It trains attention to continue. In the records and shards we found a culture that prized mending, a pot glued rather than discarded, a wall replastered rather than raised. This ethic of repair extends beyond objects to relationships and institutions. Apology, shared labor, restitution. The dream holds that flourishing is sustained by routine acts of restoration, rather than by sporadic grand gestures. A society that normalizes repair cultivates resilience. It converts loss into the opportunity for rebuilding with humility. Linked to repair is the idea of hospitality as a political practice. Hospitality in the towns we have traced was practical and ritual. A traveling merchant receives a place by the hearth. The returning family finds a bowl at the communal oven. Strangers are given small favors to re-establish trust. Hospitality increases the radius of mutual obligation and produces a social climate where difference can be bridged by shared nourishment. The dream imagines polity not as a fortress, but as a network of welcome, calibrated by limits but generous in spirit. Hospitality, when institutionalized, becomes a safety net for the vulnerable and a forge for social cohesion. The dream of humanity is also imaginative in how it balances continuity and openness. The people of the past preserved techniques and stories because they knew that raw continuity, without adaptation, calcifies culture, while change without mooring erodes identity. They taught apprentices old patterns and encouraged small innovations that did not disrupt the common. The dream therefore favors a rhythm of change that is cautious and negotiated. Adopt what sustains, discard what depletes. This pattern is wise because it recognizes that societies are not machines to be rebooted, but ecosystems to be tended. Another key dimension of the dream is education as a public duty. Apprenticeships, communal teachings and the sharing of craft knowledge ensured that skills were not hoarded. The dream holds that knowledge should be distributed widely enough that it produces redundancy and resilience. A community that concentrates skill into a few hands risks losing itself when those hands are gone. The lesson echoes the earlier call of dust: make knowledge common, not proprietary. In practice, this meant open benches, shared workshops, and public demonstrations where novices could learn the subtleties of a craft under the eye of a patient master. Closely allied to education is the ethical design of incentive. The dream recognizes that people respond to incentives, and it seeks to align those incentives with public good. Tokens and ledgers, when used to lubricate trade, must be balanced by norms that preserve transparency. Rewards for craft excellence must not distort the supply of labor for essential maintenance. The dream's governance designs small rules that keep incentives from perverting social priority. The moral imagination here is not naive. It understands human frailty and designs institutions to channel appetites productively. The dream of humanity also imagines law as a practice of rebuilding, rather than merely of punishment. The old records reveal a preference for restitution and the reintegration of wrongdoers into the social fabric. Laws that emphasized repair over retribution helped restore relationships. The dream's jurisprudence sees the law as a tool for reconciliation, for turning disruptions into occasions of learning. This legal ethos requires judges and elders who understand human complexity and possess the humility necessary to weigh restoration over strict retribution. There is also an ecological dimension to the dream. The ancient communities we study lived in a dialogue with the rhythms of water and season. They engineered terraces, channels, and planting patterns in modest humility before environmental cycles. The dream is ecological in insisting that human flourishing is a function of ecological stewardship. Keep the terraces, tend the canals, respect the limits of soil. This is not a preachy environmentalism, but a practical reciprocity. The soil returns what is given it, provided the human practice is careful and patient. The dream, importantly, includes rituals that keep memory alive. Not all memory needed to be carved in stone. Many essential practices were embodied in songs, in small festivals, and in the daily recitations that taught children the names of rivers and the lore of herbs. The dream reframes ritual as pedagogy. Rituals are not merely ceremonial, they are storage devices for knowledge. The songs that teach planting sequences, the refrains that encode codes of repair, the gestures that mark a promise, these are durable forms of wisdom. The dream preserves itself by embedding knowledge into repetition and habit. Linked with ritual is the vital practice of naming and modest commemoration. Names anchor places and keep social obligations visible. A bench, named for an ancestor, a lane called for a potter, a small plaque that marks a well. These are not vanity, they are mnemonic devices that keep social memory alive. The dream values humble commemoration that connects obligation to place, without allowing commemoration to become a tool of social exclusion or self-aggrandizement. The ethic favors common naming, wells and granaries named for the community or for functional attributes, over plaques that function only as status markers. Another strand of the dream is the cultivation of skillful governance. Leadership in these societies was less a crown than a stewardship. Leaders mediated disputes, coordinated labor, and served as custodians of the public good. The dream imagines governance as a practice of service and listening, where authority is earned through patience and humility, rather than through force or wealth. Leaders who embody the dream are teachers, as much as rulers. They are the ones who call neighbors to shared work, and model the practices of repair and restraint. The dream of humanity is not utopian, because it squares itself with limit. It acknowledges scarcity and hazard, and it designs practices that make scarcity manageable. Stored grain for lean years, rituals for coordinated labor in emergencies, distributed knowledge to avoid catastrophic specialization. This is the practical core of the dream, an ethic that transforms scarcity into a test of creativity rather than of greed. The dream's politics organizes small-scale contingencies into durable responses, making daily life less precarious by designing institutions that anticipate failure and embed repair. There is a final, deeply human strand to this dream, the insistence on beauty that heals. The builders of the past understood that beauty can soothe the soul and give courage in hard seasons. A well-crafted bowl, a carved lintel that throws soft shadow in the evening, a harmonious street that invites conversation. These are not luxuries, but salve. Beauty, when fused with utility, becomes an ethical resource. The dream holds that public life should include spaces that remind people of tenderness, small gardens, ponds, benches, where the old can sit and the young play. The aesthetic life is therefore part of the social health of a people. All these threads combine into an image of human aspiration that is modest and steady. The dream of humanity is built on the faithful accumulation of small acts, on the patient disciplining of appetite, on institutions that privilege repair and wide teaching, on hospitality that enlarges the circle of mutual obligation, and on governance that serves rather than command. It is less the dream of empire than the dream of enduring neighborhoods, of children learning crafts, of elders convening councils that balance need and beauty. It is a dream that trusts in the ordinary.
The rediscovery of ruins gives modern hands an opportunity to learn and to adapt. In reading the shards and in listening to the songs that survived in pockets of memory, we are offered practical heuristics for living well. The challenge is not to recreate an old polity, but to glean its wisdom and craft institutions that harness human desires toward public flourishing. That requires humility, to notice what works, to admit what failed, and to build accountability into leadership. It requires patience, to teach widely, to practice repair daily, to nurture beauty that is useful. It requires courage, to restrain appetite for display, and to protect common goods from becoming private trophies. In the end, the dream of humanity resists the dramatic and favors the durable. It invites us into a slow politics that values the small mercies, shared bread in bad years, a repaired bridge, a song that children can carry over single heroic gesture. If we learn to set up institutions that embed those small mercies, if we teach the young the value of mending as well as making, and if we link beauty to use rather than to vanity, we can practice a form of life that ages well. The ruins remind us, through dust and shard, that greatness is not always what dazzles from afar, but what sustains everyday life when storms come and seasons change. So the dream endures not as an impossible blueprint, but as a set of practices. Teach widely, repair readily, give modestly, govern humbly, design beauty that serves. These are the small commitments that, when repeated over generations, make a place livable and humane. In their repetition, they cultivate trust, reduce the reach of fear, and invite the possibility that when the next storm comes, people will find enough hands ready to tend the canals and to set the kiln alight. The dream of humanity is thus less a fantasy than a daily apprenticeship. It asks us to live as if our small acts mattered, because in the long run, they do. There is a last hour that descends not as a rupture, but as a careful folding, as if the entire span of a people's days were being laid into a single soft chest and closed with attentive finger. The good night of time is not a dramatic extinction. It is the slow contraction of the ordinary into memory, a deliberate action of letting go that resembles the way one covers a sleeping child with a familiar In that gentle lowering, the traces of effort are gathered: kiln ash, a scored pot rim, the faint pattern of a woven band, and placed beside the quiet things that keep a life honest, the recorded lists, the names recited by the elders, the little reparations done in darkened courtyards. The final breath of a civilization is more often a long inhalation that holds until the body settles, than a sudden exhalation. It is a closing that is careful and human. As night approaches in the long sweep of time, people make small arrangements as if to say farewell without drama. Those who remain gather in courtyards and near wells, and they speak in low voices. The conversation is not merely of loss but of intent: what should be left intact, what must be carried, what must be turned to seed for future soil. They tie bundles with the same practical care as they once tied reeds for baskets. They do not make proclamations but perform careful acts, setting a record strip into a clay jar, carving a name onto a lintel, hanging a small tool in a corner as a keepsake. These gestures are both practical and ceremonial, the ordinary and the sacred braided into a single movement. The good night is thus a ritual of tidying, an ethic of closing that honors what has been made. There is a cadence to this close. People move through tasks with the rhythm of habit, and habit is a kind of small liturgy. Bread is baked and wrapped, not for immediate use but for the next day, that may require a memory of comfort. Tools are oiled and set in racks where young hands might one day find them. A loom is released with the last hands running fingers over the final warp. The weaver counts threads, murmurs a name, and ties a knot that marks continuity. A teacher reads a familiar line aloud to children who will not all be able to stay. Each action is a lit candle placed in a long room, minor, practical light that together keeps the last hours from being absolute darkness. The good night is as much about choosing what to protect as about deciding to leave. Families often choose a few items to carry forward, small reliquaries of daily life that can root memory elsewhere. A potter might take a favorite tool whose curve fits a hand in a manner no other tool can. A baker will tuck a recipe into a cloth. An elder will whisper the cadence of a particular lullaby into a grandchild's ear. These items and stories travel, and in their travel they seed other places with fragments of the life that was. The act of carrying is not only practical, it is an act of witness. In moving a useful bowl or a named strip of clay, people bear testimony to a series of lives and to the way those lives were ordered. There is also a public aspect to the farewell. Where possible, people mark the commons with small inscriptions that register what was shared: a granary's intended care, a cannon for water rotations, a recorded agreement that names responsibilities. These marks are not grand monuments. They are modest anchors meant to speak to anyone who might later come, an instruction to remember how to open the sluice, a list of neighbors who once pledged a day's labor to the canal. Such inscriptions are practical legacies, the tools of a small pedagogy aimed at preserving practice, rather than proclaiming fame. They are spoken into clay and stone so that should someone return, they might find a map of living practice, rather than the hollow echo of pomp. The final gatherings often include small acts of repair. The habit of mending is itself a part of how people say goodnight. A cracked jar is carefully sealed, not because it will be used again but because mending honors the work of the maker. Walls are repointed with slow hands. A public bench is hewn smoother where many had once sat. These acts, though they may appear sentimental, are earnest. They restore dignity to objects, and through objects to people. Repairing the good night has a twofold aim, practical and mnemonic. It keeps tools serviceable for those who might return and signals respect for the labor that made them. As the last days fold, songs are often chosen that carry more than melody. People pick refrains that compress stories, the small narratives that taught children which herbs soothed a fever, how to read the swell of the river, when to mend a roof. The songs are practical, but they are also repositories of feeling. Singing in this hour is less about performance and more about communal breath, a way to align hearts and to pass on knowledge in forms that survive hunger and migration. Those who can sing aloud teach, those who cannot whisper lines into ears. The music of closure is quiet, not declamatory. Its purpose is to make the last hours gentle. Religious practice, where it holds, becomes an important frame for farewell. Priests and custodians of ritual move in these last times as guides and as keepers of small ceremonies that order. They do not promise miracles. Their work is more about making a space where sorrow can be shared, and where memory is ritualized. They may bless items to be carried, they may close a shrine with quiet words, and they may sit in a communal place to hear names spoken aloud so that names will not vanish. This practice is practical theology. It underlines that the sacred and the mundane are braided, and that saying goodnight is a moral act of responsibility. Sometimes when resources allow, people decide to preserve certain elements of the common life for future return. A kiln might be left intact and sealed with a small stone marker instructing how to relight it, or a well might be fenced carefully so that future hands may find it in better condition. Such acts are investments in the possibility of return. They carry the quiet hope that absence may be temporary and that someone, someday, might wish to begin again from what was left. These gestures are not naivete. They are small, prudent calculations, pruning a garden so that someone else can step into it years later and find a foundation. The good night is also a lesson in generosity. Those who have more than others sometimes choose not to make a display of departure, but to redistribute what they can, so that those who cannot travel with much can at least leave with dignity, some token of material security and the knowledge that others will remember. These acts of measured generosity preserve social dignity and the sense that even in ending a shared life, people can be ethical toward one another. In the economy of final days, dignity is among the most precious currency. As families move on and the public places thin, the town's silhouette changes slowly. Doorways once used for lively comings and goings become frames where wind carries seeds and light. Courtyards that hosted storytelling are claimed by small grasses and by seeds that fall into cracks. The market, sealed and covered, becomes a place where birds roost and where the light makes a patterned net across the stone. In the gradual abandonment, there is a poignancy that is both visual and tactile, a handrail warmed by countless palms, a stone smoothed by years of feet, a hinge that closes with a last soft creak. These are not tragic images for mere spectacle, they are honest records of ordinary human life made visible in the small traces that remain. There is an economy of silence that settles in these last hours, a softening that is not void but reserved. People do not clamor for the past, they carry what they can and leave the rest with an intention. They do not burn en masse. Ritual fire might be used to transform records into smoke that carries names into air, or to disinfect a dusty storeroom, but wholesale destruction is rare. The good night is not violence, it is a careful turning away, an act of stewardship that recognizes the limits of possession and the fidelity due to what has been made. After the final departures, when only the wind and a few steadfast keepers remain, the town's rhythm slows into a new kind of existence. Vines take the place of draped cloth, lichen writes new patterns across once familiar friezes. The moon resumes its patient circle, indifferent to human schemes yet witness to their care. Over seasons and years the place becomes a palimpsest. The architecture and the plant life coexist in a way that makes neither entirely dominant. In that long dialogue, the town's last shapes linger, traces that afford the possibility of memory and, if tended, of return. The good night offers, in its end, a quiet promise. It is not the promise that everything will be preserved intact or that loss will be undone. Rather, it promises that care can be extended into absence, that leaving can be an ethical practice that shelters memory for future attention. The sleepers of an abandoned town are not simply reduced to relics, they are held in the attentive gestures of those who chose what to take and what to leave. The promise is modest: seeds, a named strip, a sealed well, a small song at the lips of an elder. These are the contracts that bridge time. Across the centuries, the town's story, its making, its flourishing, its shadowed desire, its fracture, its last light, its abandonment, its slow rediscovery, becomes a single narrative strand in a larger human fabric. That fabric teaches what it always has, that civilizations are built from small acts repeated, from mercy as administered daily, from the virtue of repair, and from humility toward nature and neighbor. The good night does not erase those lessons, rather it enfolds them, preserving them in a manner that patient listeners and later curious hands can read. The town sleeps, but it is not silent to the attentive ear. Its ashes and its shards speak in modest tones to anyone willing to learn. There is, at the end, a tenderness in the final sleep, the caretaking of the last acts, the sealing of a mortar joint, the naming of a public well, the whispering of a lullaby, are acts of love. They are not grand politics but small ethics. They make the final hours sacred in their ordinariness. They teach that endings can be dignified and that leaving can be an act of guardianship rather than of abandonment. In that practice, life continues in new forms, seeds carried to new fields, songs hummed to new children, techniques taught in other valleys. The good night then is not a terminus but a hinge, and when the long hush truly settles, when moss softens the last sharp edges and the moon lays a cool impartial sheet over stones and over the sleeping earth, there is a single concluding thought that feels right and whole. It is not an end in the blunt sense, but a soft closure that offers rest and a possibility of waking in another time. The people who once built these lanes and tuned these kilns are not wholly gone. They live in recipes, in knots learned in apprenticeship, in stories carried by old women to new hearths, and in the small practical wisdoms embedded in mud and stone. And so, in the patient fashion of the world, the story draws to its final line, the softest possible dismissal, the kind that lowers a curtain without slamming it, the evening phrase that honors both what was done and what might be revived when another careful hand reads the sign. And so, history sleeps again.